Chapter 462. A strange change occurred in the battle on the Long Street. The Fuyun division was about to suffer a humiliating and crushing defeat that had not been seen for many years. In the center of the cultivation world, in the Celestial City, under the attention of countless people, they were slapped in the face by the devil cult. They were utterly humiliated. However, things took a turn for the better in the end. Under the leadership of the wise Zheng Xianmeng and several deity transformation stage deities, the strong and tenacious Fuyunji remained calm in the face of danger. The more they suffered, the braver they became. They found a chance of survival in the desperate situation. With the help of a powerful shadow that had infiltrated the devil cult, they broke the devil cult's trap and killed their way into the devil's cave. Finally, they destroyed the devil cult's lair that had been operating in the immortal city for decades. They killed and captured more than 100 devil cult demons. Although the only flaw was that the devil cult's chief ghost elder still managed to escape, this battle had already dealt a heavy blow to the devil cult's vitality and greatly boosted the morale of the righteous path of the world. It also proved once again that the Fuyun division was indeed an iron army personally created by Lord Tianlan. They were the guardians of justice, and they were the masters of steel that always upheld justice and justice. Isn't this boasting a bit too much? Lu Qin held the notice in his hand and looked at old Ma with a helpless expression. At this time in Lu Chen's room, old Ma and White Lotus were all there. The black dog that was injured in the battle on the Long Street was also there. However, this time it was not lying on the ground. It was probably because it had contributed greatly to Lu Chen in the previous battle and was gloriously injured, so its status was greatly increased. Now it was lying on the soft bed proudly, taking up most of the space. However, Lu Chen did not suffer any loss. He sat on the edge of the bed and directly leaned on the hill-like black dog, looking very comfortable. Old Ma coughed and took the notice. He smiled and said, "I think it's okay. It's not much different from the truth." White Lotus, who was next to him, interrupted, "You yourself said that you were bragging. Isn't it better to say that you were bragging? Otherwise you might as well say that you were beaten up by the devil cult." Lu Chen rolled his eyes at the sharp-tongued girl, then asked old Ma, "What was the final result of the battle? Was it really as the notice said?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "No." Lu Chen's face revealed an, as expected, expression. The corners of his mouth twitched as he asked, "How many are there?" Old Ma thought about it and said, "I killed more than a dozen of them and captured less than 10 alive." "What?" This time it was White Lotus who was taken aback. She said in astonishment, "It's so different from what the notice said?" Lu Chen laughed and said to White Lotus, "Weren't you looking down on me just now? Why can't you hold it in now?" White Lotus snorted and looked a little annoyed. "I originally thought that it's okay to brag in Fuyunji. After all, we defeated the devil cult. But the number of people killed went from a dozen or 20 to over 100. It's a little too exaggerated." It had to be said that even when a beautiful girl was angry, she still had a unique charm. Not to mention that White Lotus had a beautiful and outstanding appearance. Lu Chen and old Ma couldn't help but take another look at the beautiful girl, who was pouting slightly but vaguely captivating. Old Ma said with a smile, "That's why I said that you two are still too young. Look at me looking at this thing, your faces are calm and your mood is very calm." Lu Chen spat and said, "It's fine if you're talking about White Lotus, but how old am I? How can I be a young person? Forget it. Anyway, no matter how exaggerated this matter is, it has nothing to do with me." Old Ma was about to speak when White Lotus interrupted and said angrily, "What do you mean forget it? You two old men are so great because you're old? Let me tell you, I've already grown up. Knowledge, experience and cultivation are all up to you. If I'm worse than you in any aspect, it's my loss." After saying that, she even straightened her body and puffed out her chest with a solemn expression. This time Lu Chen and old Ma didn't dare to look at her anymore. Very quickly, they moved their gazes away from this already grown-up girl. They looked at each other and both looked a little embarrassed. Old Ma coughed dryly and said, "It can't be said that it has nothing to do with you. After all, it was you who made a great contribution at the critical moment and saved Fuyunji's face." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "It's not easy to say that. After all, it was so many brothers in Fuyunji who fought to the death that they could defeat the evil faction." At this moment, White Lotus interrupted again and said, "If you ask me, they really didn't take you seriously. They just casually set a shadow and brought you over. At that time, if you hadn't found the underground lair of the evil faction, I don't know how Fuyunji would have ended up." Lu Chen looked at White Lotus strangely and said with slight surprise, "What's wrong with you today? Why are you always speaking up for me?" Old Ma smiled and said, "How can you say that? That day when the tunnel collapsed, you didn't run out. White Lotus was very worried outside and has been anxiously looking for someone to save you. White Lotus's cheeks turned slightly red and then she snorted and said, "Nonsense. I'm not anxious because of him." As she said that, she walked over and sat beside Luchin. She reached out and patted Atsu's head and glared at the black dog and said, "I'm anxious because of Atsu. This dog still owes me something, I can't let it die like this. Am I right, Atsu?" Atsu, whose butt was burned, raised its head and looked at White Lotus. It wagged its tail and barked. White Lotus smiled and nodded slightly. She looked at Atsu as if saying, "At least you know what's good for you." Luchin also smiled and ignored them. He turned to Old Ma and said, "Well, let's not talk about these useless things. I have something to tell you." Before he finished speaking, they suddenly heard a few steady and crisp knocks on the door, which immediately interrupted their conversation. The expressions of the three people in the room changed slightly. After a while, Old Ma nodded to them and walked over to open the door. They saw a woman standing outside the door. She was charming and beautiful, which made people's eyes light up. It was the leader of Fuyunji Shuang. Her position in Fuyunji and even in the whole of Zhangxianming was very important and should not be underestimated. Lu Qin and the others were a little surprised and stood up one after another. Shuang walked in and nodded to Old Ma and White Lotus. Then her gaze fell on Lu Qin. After looking him up and down, she said, "Are your injuries healed, Lu Qin?" Lu Qin nodded and said, "I'm almost healed. Thank you for your care, Hallmaster Shui." Shuang shook her head and said, "It's all thanks to Lord True Monarch that you can recover so quickly. I don't dare to take advantage of you." As she spoke, she walked over and gestured for the others to sit down. She casually pulled over a stool and sat in front of Lu Qin. She said, "But I still didn't think that Lord True Monarch would value you so much." Lu Qin's heart moved, but his expression did not change much. He only smiled and said, "Hallmaster Shui is too polite. I'm just a small character. They're all dead. Lord True Monarch's kindness only saved my life once." Shui Ying's expression seemed a little strange. She stared at Lu Qin for a while with deep meaning in her eyes. Then she said calmly, "I came here especially for you. Pack your things and come with me. The disciple acceptance ceremony will be held in 3 days. Come with me to Heavenly Dragon Mountain." Lu Qin was startled. Before he could speak, White Lotus, who was beside him, interrupted in surprise, "Disciple acceptance? Who wants to accept a disciple? What's going on?" Everyone looked at her and saw that this young girl was frowning slightly. Her eyes were wide open and her face was slightly pale. She looked like she had suddenly become agitated. However, the few people present were all experienced individuals with sharp eyes. With a single glance, they could tell that for some unknown reason, Bai Lian's beautiful face suddenly seemed to be filled with fear. In fact, there was even a sliver of despair. Chapter 463. The room immediately became quiet. Lu Qin, Old Ma, and Shuang all had strange expressions on their faces. Everyone looked towards White Lotus at the same time. White Lotus, after losing her composure for a moment, quickly noticed the expressions of the others. She was startled for a moment and the expression on her face also stiffened. After a while, she quickly regained her composure. After forcing a smile, she said to everyone, "This is a great joyous occasion. How come I've never heard of it? You Lu Qin actually keeping your mouth shut. I've never heard you mention it before." Although this beautiful girl was trying her best to smooth things over, the reluctance in her expression still fell into everyone's eyes. However, they naturally could not say anything. Not long after, White Lotus found an excuse to leave. Shuang seemed indifferent to this. Although White Lotus was beautiful and moving, it could not possibly affect a girl like her. Instead, when she saw that Lu Qin and Old Ma's expressions were somewhat strange, she even smiled and asked in a seemingly profound manner, "What, do you feel sorry for them?" "Of course not." Old Ma was the first to bluntly deny it. He said, "I just find it strange that she suddenly became like this. We didn't offend her just now." Shuang snorted and turned to look at Lu Qin. She said, "Don't tell me that you don't know in your heart?" Lu Qin hesitated for a moment. He frowned slightly and said, "Is she also interested in that position? It can't be to this extent, right?" Sitting to the side, Old Ma's expression changed. Shuang, on the other hand, said indifferently, "Why not? That is the title of a true sovereign's direct disciple. It is like a protective talisman. It is a guarantee that one can rampage through the world and have a bright future. Who doesn't want it?" Old Ma seemed to understand the meaning behind these two's words. After a moment of silence, he said, But doesn't she already have that identity? Shuang retorted, can the dead compare to the living? Of course they could not compare. Everyone knew the answer to this, and the three people present were all clear-minded people, so they could naturally think of this point. However, there was a deeper meaning. Old Ma did not ask and Shuang did not say. In the end, it was Lu Qin who sighed with a helpless look on his face. He shook his head slightly, smiled bitterly and said, it turns out that she really wants Tianlan to be her teacher. Since this topic was brought up by Lu Qin, Shuang no longer had any misgivings. She coldly said, originally we didn't think that at such a young age she could actually be so. She was probably too embarrassed to say something like shameless. Shuang snorted and changed the topic. Lord True Monarch took her in back then and announced it to the world. Naturally, she had some use for it. However, I didn't think that she could actually forget her teacher's kindness so quickly and want to climb higher. At this point, the meaning was already very clear. Shuang obviously thought that after her teacher, Hakushin Jinkuan, died, White Lotus had instantly forgotten her teacher's kindness in raising her. She even disregarded the unclear relationship between True Monarch Tianlan and Hakushin Jinkuan's death, and tried in vain to become True Monarch Tianlan's disciple again. As for True Monarch Tianlan taking her in and not killing her, of course, it was to show the world that he had nothing to do with Hakushin Jinkuan's death. I've already taken in that senior brother's little disciple, am I not afraid of raising a tiger in my bosom? Besides, isn't it too much for me to plot and kill senior brother Bai Qin? That was the gist of it. Before this, both Lu Qin and Old Ma felt that White Lotus was a precocious and abnormally intelligent girl. They had imagined many of her reactions and even felt that she might endure humiliation and cultivate to great success in the future. Then she would find an opportunity to kill True Monarch Tianlan. They wouldn't be surprised. However, they really didn't expect that White Lotus actually didn't seem to take Hakushin Jinkuan's kindness as a master seriously. It was as if she was really looking forward to becoming True Monarch Tianlan's disciple. Old Ma glanced at Lu Qin and asked, when you were on Mount Kunlun, did you see White Lotus and Hakushin Jinkuan not get along? Lu Qin shook his head and said, no. At that time, she was very arrogant and only spoke of her identity as the True Monarch's disciple with pride. Old Ma was speechless. Beside him, Shuang stood up with a frown and said, all right, let's not talk about this nonsense. Lu Qin, the True Monarch has indeed decided to accept you as a disciple and has decided to make a grand event. In addition to announcing it to the world, he will also invite 5 other True Monarchs of the Immortal Alliance to witness it in the main hall of Mount Tianlong's Fuyunji. At the same time, he will announce your past achievements. Old Ma and Lu Qin were shocked at the same time. Old Ma was anxious and asked in surprise, Hall Master, do you mean that Lu Qin's past deeds in the devil cult will also be mentioned? Shuang nodded and said, yes. Old Ma was speechless while Lu Qin sat in the distance without moving. After a while, he said in a low voice, are you all afraid that I won't die quickly enough? What he did in the devil cult was certainly a great achievement for the righteous path in Zhengxianming, but for the devil cult, it was a blood feud. So much so that he had to hide his name for more than 10 years after the Battle of the Desolate Valley. He was afraid that the devil cult would madly pursue and kill him for revenge. Now, in the disciple acceptance ceremony, once this matter was made public, needless to say, the devil cult would immediately know that the only successor of True Monarch Tianlan was the traitor who destroyed the god-subduing mantra. One must know that Elder Ghost was not dead yet. No one knew how many remaining evildoers there were in the devil cult, how many hidden masters there were, and how many madmen there were. Shuang of course also understood the crux of this. So at this time, the gaze she looked at Lu Qin gradually softened. No matter what, although she was very envious of such a hot position, she really did not dare to sit on it so openly. This is True Monarch's intention. Shuang slowed down her tone and said to Lu Qin with a hint of comfort, before I went down the mountain, True Monarch specially asked me to come over and explain this to you. His original words were, as his disciple and the successor of the Tian character Taoist name in Kunlun, these are all small difficulties, nothing to him. Lu Qin snorted and said, he is a deity realm True Monarch, naturally it is nothing to him. Shuang ignored the resentment in Lu Qin's words. She just coughed lightly and said, he also said either you are afraid, don't go up the mountain to be his disciple, leave the immortal city and never appear in front of him again, or you deal with everything yourself. If you die in the hands of the devil cult's evildoers in the future, it is because you are useless. Lu Qin's expression was indifferent. After a while he stood up and said, let's go up the mountain. Old Ma wanted to say something but stopped. He stretched out his hand as if he wanted to stop him, but in the end, his hand fell down powerlessly. A trace of a smile appeared on Shui Ying's face. But when Lu Qin walked past Shui Ying, his footsteps suddenly paused, then he turned to look at Shui Ying. After a while, he suddenly said, "In those words just now, you probably added some oil to the fire, right?" He said indifferently, "Although I always scold that baldy for being shameless and a bastard, that person would never say such heartless words to me." As he said this, he ignored Shui Ying's suddenly somewhat stiff expression and walked past her. Chapter 464. On Mount Tianlong inside the Kunlun Hall. This palace was the residence of perfected Lord Tianlan on Mount Celestial Dragon. As the residence of a divine transformation realm perfected lord who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, this palace was built in a lofty and magnificent manner, which matched perfected Lord Tianlan's towering and burly appearance. From afar he looked like a legendary giant overlooking the mortal world. As for the name Kunlun, needless to say, it was naturally from true Lord Tianlan's own sect, the Kunlun Party. Over the years, countless people had flattered true Lord Tianlan here, saying that he did not forget his roots, that he cared about his hometown and sect, and that he was truly a person with true feelings. Of course, such treatment was only given to perfected Lord Tianlan alone. If it was any other person, everyone would probably say something along the lines of, "This lad is stupid and disrespectful, going against the sect. How can anyone use the sect's name as the name of their residence? Damn it, damn it, damn it, damn it." Not far from the Kunlun Hall was the main hall of Fuyunji. The two halls were over 100 feet apart, and they echoed each other. The Fuyunji Hall looked a bit shorter than the Kunlun Hall, and there seemed to be some meaning behind it. Lu Qin, Old Ma and Shui Ying walked past the Fuyunji Hall, and continued to the Kunlun Hall at the back. Lu Qin looked up and saw that there was no common hall plaque hanging in front of the hall. Instead, in the empty space 10 feet in front of the hall's main entrance, there was a huge boulder that had been moved from somewhere, sitting there like a small mountain. On top of it were two large words, Kunlun. When they got closer, Lu Chen's eyes fell on the two words. He saw that the handwriting on the stone was like iron and silver hooks, bold and powerful, especially at the end of the writing, which was deep and intense as if it was going to break through the stone and leave, which was amazing. He took a few more glances and saw that there were only these two words on the stone, but no signature. He asked Old Ma, who was walking beside him, "Who wrote these two words?" Before Old Ma could answer, Shui Ying, who was walking in front, had already turned around and replied, "This was written by Lord True Monarch himself." Old Ma was startled when he saw Shui Ying's expression from the side. He realized that although this woman's face was calm, there was a hint of worry in her eyes. Her gaze was also fixed on Lu Qin. Lu Qin replied with an "oh," and nodded slightly. However, he did not look at Shui Ying and continued to walk forward. When he walked past Shui Ying, she seemed to have something to say, but after opening her mouth, she hesitated. In the end, she followed him without saying a word. Not long after, the three of them arrived outside the Kunlun Palace. Someone on the side reported in, and soon after, Lord True Monarch Tianlan's decree was passed down, inviting them inside to meet. After passing through the thick and heavy palace door that was about 7 or 8 people tall, they arrived at the vast and magnificent main hall. 9 giant pillars supported the dome and were carved with clouds and mist-coiling dragons. In front of the main hall, on a tall white jade lotus throne, Lord True Monarch Tianlan was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, resting on his wide sleeves and shiny hair. When they raised their heads and looked up, that person was solemn like a god, causing people to involuntarily feel a sense of reverence and worship. When Shui Ying and Old Ma arrived, they both wore deep and respectful expressions, prostrating long ago under the throne. Only Lu Qin glanced at the half-human half-god figure on the lotus throne, then turned his gaze away with an indifferent expression. He walked to the side of a stone pillar and carefully looked at the carvings on it. "Since you've come here, why don't you kneel before me?" A deep voice that sounded like thunder suddenly rang out in the palace, rumbling like thunder. It was as if a god was speaking, causing people to revere it. Shui Ying and Old Ma's bodies trembled slightly, their heads lowered even more, and there was a faint look of fear on their faces. For some reason in this Kunlun Palace, Lord True Monarch Tianlan's aura was many times stronger than usual. Moreover, following his voice, the entire palace seemed to be resonating with him, as if this incomparably powerful true monarch had already become one with this towering and majestic palace, transforming into a true god, looking down on the insignificant ants of the human world. The only exception was probably Lu Qin. Perhaps he was a stubborn ant. In such a situation, Lu Qin did not seem to be affected by the true monarch's aura at all. He only waved his hand and did not even turn his head. There was even a hint of impatience in his tone as he said, "You haven't acknowledged me as your master yet. It won't be too late to kneel after you've acknowledged me as your master." On the lotus throne, Lord True Monarch Tianlan suddenly opened his eyes. At that moment, there seemed to be endless surging waves in the depths of his eyes, as if the world was spinning and there was a violent storm. He looked like a god or a demon. In the quiet palace, there seemed to be thunder and lightning exploding in the silence. The atmosphere was terrifying, as if it was about to freeze one's blood. After a moment, the terrifying demon-like light and shadow retracted into his eyes. Lord True Monarch Tianlan blinked and chuckled, "Oh, that's fine too." After casually asking a few questions, Lord True Monarch Tianlan ordered Shui Ying and Old Ma to leave first. After the two of them left the Kunlun Palace, they walked all the way to the side of the huge boulder with the words Kunlun carved on it. Only then did they both heave a sigh of relief, feeling the terrifying pressure that had been pressing down on their hearts slowly recede. The two of them looked at each other with reverence on their faces. Old Ma sighed and said with lingering fear, "I don't know why, but every time I come here to have an audience with Lord True Monarch, I always feel uneasy. I'm especially reverent towards Lord True Monarch." Shuang seemed to have the same feeling. However, her cultivation was high and she was shrewd, so she quickly regained her composure. However, there was still a trace of anxiety in her eyes. She turned back to look at the palace. At the side, Old Ma coughed and said, "Hall Master, don't worry. Lu Qin is not a talkative person. He knows what he should say and what he shouldn't say." Shuang turned back to look at Old Ma and raised her eyebrows slightly. "Really?" Old Ma said frankly, "I've known him for many years. Other than Lord True Monarch, there shouldn't be anyone in the world who knows him better than me." Shuang slowly nodded. Although she didn't say anything, her expression clearly showed that she was relieved. Old Ma secretly cursed in his heart. However, in the face of this powerful woman he was not like Lu Qin. He was still tactful. He immediately changed the topic with a smile. Then he hinted that before he came, he had already discussed it with Lu Qin and so on. What happened before was just a misunderstanding. Of course, it must be that Lu Qin's brain was stiff and he inexplicably misunderstood Hall Master. In short, everything was that idiot Lu Qin's fault. "Hall Master, you don't have to worry." Shuang was very happy after hearing this. When she looked at Old Ma again, she immediately felt that he was more pleasing to the eye. She nodded slightly and said, I didn't realize before that you were also a capable person. If you have time in the future, come visit me more often. Perhaps I can be of help to you." Old Ma laughed and hurriedly cupped his hands in thanks. Then the two of them talked and laughed harmoniously, looking like old friends who had known each other for many years. At the same time, in the solemn Kunlun Great Hall, Lord True Monarch Tianlan, who was sitting on the throne, glared angrily. He looked as terrifying as a demon god. He said to Lu Qin below, "Hey, why are you so insensible? There were outsiders here just now. Why can't you give me some face?" T. Lu Qin turned around rudely and looked at the damn baldy. He scolded, "Didn't you tell me when I was young that the 9 dragons' Dharma bodies Tao, magic and divine sense was a trick of a Jianghu swindler? Now you're actually using it?" Lord True Monarch Tianlan coughed and said seriously, "Later on I found that this thing was quite useful, so I used it for a while." "What's wrong with that?" Lu Qin sneered and looked disdainful. Then he said angrily, "You're too unkind. You said that you wanted to take me as your disciple and announced to the world that you would let me reach the heavens in a single step. But in fact you're putting me on a fire to roast. You're probably afraid that I won't die, right? You still want me to respect you and bow down to you?" Scram. Lu Qin looked very annoyed as he scolded the Divine Transformation Realm True Monarch. Chapter 465. In today's Zhengxianming, Fuyunji could be said to be the most powerful hall, and this strength was not only in terms of combat power, but also in many other aspects. The most obvious one was the execution and efficiency of doing things. Overstaffed was basically the most appropriate description of the many halls in Zhengxianming. Many years of rule and ease had long made everyone lax. Anyway, the dirtiest, most tiring and most dangerous work was done by those idiots in Fuyunji. Wouldn't they be stupid if they didn't enjoy it? At the very most, they would just have to give in to the arrogant soldiers and valiant generals of the Floating Clouds Company. Furthermore, even if things got out of hand, everyone had their own backing. Was the Floating Clouds Company backed by perfected Lord Tianlan? I have one here too. In short, even if they quarreled at the end of the day, it was for the world's righteousness, justice, the overall situation of the righteous path and other more important things. Everyone would be fine if they each took a step back as long as they didn't suffer any immediate losses. Therefore, for many years, probably only Fuyunji, who had foolishly fought with the most dangerous enemy, the devil cult, could still maintain that kind of bloody and sharp aura. Take this time, true Lord Tianlan's plan to hold a disciple ceremony for example. He had announced this to the public 3 days ago, but if the task of organizing this disciple ceremony was given to any other hall in Zhangxianming, not to mention 3 days, even if you gave them a month, they might still mess it up. Everyone would kick each other's balls and quarrel with each other. In addition, each of them would secretly take some money from these missions. After about 3 months, the budget would increase by 5 or 6 times and it would be done. Fuyunji was different. The group led by Shuang mobilized all the forces at hand and did their best. Then, everything was set up in 3 days, and according to true Lord Tianlan's instructions, they informed all the important people in Zhangxianming, big and small. After all, perfected Lord Tianlan's status was unquestionable. Moreover, his disciple recruitment this time round was akin to his direct line of descent, so he had to take him seriously. However, there were still some restraints in the process. If he really wanted to go all out with perfected Lord Tianlan's identity, not only would he cause a stir in the Immortal City and the perfected Immortal Alliance, he would also cause a stir in the human cultivation world and countless sects and clans in the entire Divine Land. As long as he sent an invitation, they would probably all come. Of course, in this way the time would be delayed for a long time. After all, China was so vast and it would take time for people from remote places to come over, right? Shuang, who personally presided over and organized the apprenticeship ceremony, had even specifically consulted true Lord Tianlan about this matter. At first, true Lord Tianlan had hesitated because it seemed that this damn Baldy really wanted to hold a world-shaking ceremony. However, in the end, this matter was indeed too troublesome. Putting aside everything else, once the invitations were sent out, by the time the ceremony began, there would at least be an extra 100,000 cultivators in the Immortal City, right? At that time, how would they be managed? How would they be settled? These were all headache-inducing problems. Therefore, after discussing with Shuang, perfected Lord Tianlan gave up this somewhat unrealistic idea and decided to only invite his friends from the Immortal Alliance who were currently in the Immortal City to attend the ceremony. On this day, the entire Celestial Dragon Mountain and the huge Immortal City seemed to have fallen into a carnival atmosphere. Everywhere in Zhangxianming was decorated with lanterns and streamers. The usually solemn Kunlun Hall was also filled with a joyous atmosphere. Since early in the morning, there had been many cultivators walking around. At the same time as time passed, more and more cultivators from Zhangxianming arrived. Everyone called out to their friends with smiles on their faces. Each of them looked harmonious and humorous. At the same time, they laughed and guessed who the luckiest person in the world was. What was his identity and origin? Why had they never heard of this person before? Who would have thought that the best seat in Zhangxianming that everyone had been longing for decades would actually be taken by this stranger? There were too many such things to count. At least, most people knew nothing about this young man called Lu Qin who suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Then they felt jealousy and hatred towards him. Why didn't I encounter such a thing as a free lunch in the sky? That guy didn't do anything. He was unknown, but he gained the trust of a divine transformation stage perfected lord. Then he rose to the top in one step. Was there any fairness in this world? Why wasn't that person me? These were the thoughts and voices that lingered in the minds of many people. As for the real identity and origin of Lu Qin, no one actually tried to get to the bottom of it. If a divine transformation stage perfected lord took a fancy to you and accepted you as a disciple, of course there would be no problem. It was possible that their old man had lost his mind. However, as the strongest and youngest divine transformation stage perfected lord among the 6 perfected lords, although many people disliked him, no one had ever doubted his strength and judgment. Around noon, the most famous divine transformation stage perfected lords in Zhangxianming came leisurely on colorful clouds. Along the way they were all high and mighty, looking down on the world, and looked extremely arrogant. Of course, they did have the capital to be arrogant. In the secular world, the people of Zhangxianming had always respected them and regarded them as half-human and half-god figures. Perfected Lord Tianlan personally came to the entrance of the main hall of Kunlun and bowed to these 5 old brothers. Everyone stood together. The 6 divine transformation stage perfected lords of Zhangxianming were awe-inspiring and powerful. Although they were just chatting, there was a large empty space around them. There was a faint sound of wind and thunder, which was awe-inspiring. After chatting for a while and receiving many sincere or fake congratulations, perfected Lord Tianlan, who was smiling, personally invited the 5 divine transformation stage perfected lords who had come to watch the ceremony and congratulate them into the main hall. After they went in, someone outside the house shouted, "The ceremony begins." The 6 perfected lords walked into the main hall and saw that both sides of the hall were already filled with people. There were 5 big chairs placed under the tall lotus throne in the center, and there were several rows of chairs behind it. The people sitting on the chairs were the real figures of Zhengxianmeng. They were under the 6 perfected lords and were the high-level cultivators who ruled over billions of lives in the vast land of the Divine Land. Further away were the cultivators of Zhengxianmeng who had almost come to watch the show. Most of them were standing, but there were also many good-looking figures among them. Obviously, there were also hidden dragons and crouching tigers. After a while, everyone sat down. Perfected Lord Tianlan returned to the lotus throne and his expression turned solemn. It could be said that he looked solemn and dignified like a god. The people in the main hall immediately felt the powerful aura and quieted down, looking at him with some reverence. After a while, someone sang, "Lu Chen has come to see you." The sound of footsteps was heard. Like a gust of wind, everyone, including the divine transformation stage perfected lords, looked back and saw a figure walking in from outside with steady steps. It was Lu Chen. At that moment, countless eyes fell on him. Some were like fire, some were like fire, some were like frost, some were like snow, some were as gentle as water, and some were as cold as knives. Lu Chen seemed not to feel anything around him. He walked all the way to the lotus throne. Contrary to his usual unruly manner, his expression was solemn and respectful. He actually quietly and honestly knelt on the ground, giving the person on the lotus throne enough face. He clearly kowtowed a few times and then said in a voice that everyone in the main hall could hear, "Disciple Lu Chen pays respect to master." After saying that, he lowered his body and closed his eyes slightly. When his face was close to the ground and he felt the coldness of the stones on the ground, for some reason, Lu Chen suddenly remembered that day many years ago in a deserted and dirty corner. He also knelt in front of the same person and called out the 2 words, "Master." Suddenly, decades passed in the blink of an eye. The child of that year had grown up. And at this moment, was his heart as pious as it was back then? He closed his eyes, letting all the light disappear into the depths of his pupils. Chapter 466. Good get up. Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the lotus throne, smiled and looked at Lu Chen as he stood up. He nodded slightly as if he was very satisfied with this disciple he had just accepted. What followed next was the usual procedure of acknowledging a master as a disciple. The only difference was that some people simply kowtowed 3 times. However, since Supreme Lord Tianlan had made such a big scene, he naturally had to do it from the beginning to the end. There was even someone who was singing at the side. Moreover, this person had a high status and was very eye-catching. It was the Floating Clouds Division's Hall Master, Shuiying. During the ceremony, Lu Chen's eyes inadvertently swept across the crowd next to him. Other than the 5 prominent perfected gods in the front row, there was a group of people standing in the front row, and many of them were familiar faces. That was where the members of the Kunlun party were gathered. Lord Tianlan's current status in the Kunlun party was self-evident. It would not be an exaggeration to say that he was a leading figure. It was only because he did not want to be too troublesome. Otherwise, with his status, if he accepted a disciple, the Kunlun party sect leader, Yuanning perfected persons, except those who were in seclusion, and those who had some status above the Jindan realm would have to come, even if they were thousands of miles away. At this moment, Lu Chen looked over and saw that many people from the Kunlun party had a strange expression on their faces. Standing at the front, other than Masato Kihara and a few other Yuanning perfected persons, the outstanding-looking Su Qingjun was also standing there, staring at Lu Chen with a somewhat complicated expression. Their eyes met for a moment, then Su Qingjun quietly looked away. And at the back of all the people, there was still one person standing there silently. He was young, handsome, in his prime, and talented. He was a proud son of heaven. Among his peers, he had high hopes from his elders and was respected by his peers. Other than Su Qingjun, there was almost no one else who could be compared to him. It was he. He had thought that the person in the limelight was him. For this, he had even betrayed his own master and worked hard for the person on the lotus throne, risking his life for his great cause. He had thought that everything was his. Until today when he saw Lu Chen standing in the crowd. His eyes had been fixed on the person who had stolen everything from him. If his eyes could turn into a blade, he would have cut him into pieces and turned his bones into ashes. But the fact was that he could not get what he wanted, so he could only desperately suppress himself. His hatred, jealousy, and anger turned into sharp blades that could not hurt others, but were cutting himself. He did not even dare to raise his head to look at the lofty perfected Lord Tianlan, because he was afraid that a single glance would expose his hatred and alarm that person. In that case, what awaited him might be a tragic death. Why does such a person exist in this world? He thought fiercely in his heart. He stared at Lu Qin and unsurprisingly recognized him. He remembered that he was the one who had forced Lu Qin into the Dragon River in the Land of Chaos. But in just a few years he had become perfected Lord Tianlan's direct disciple? Perhaps he would inherit his legacy in the future? And then steal everything from him? So all of you were lying to me. He slowly said in his heart, word by word. After the disciple acceptance ceremony was over, Shuiying turned to perfected Lord Tianlan with a questioning look in her eyes. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. He floated down from the lotus throne and landed beside Lu Qin. His expression was solemn, but he held Lu Qin's right hand and said loudly, "From today onwards I will give you the Taoist name, Tian, and the name Ming." As he spoke, he looked around and pointed to the sky and then to the ground with a solemn expression. Heaven and earth Kunlun, passed down from generation to generation. Lu Qin knelt down in front of him again and kowtowed. One person in each generation, heaven will never be extinguished. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed and helped Lu Qin up. At this time, the divine transformation realm perfected lords who were watching the ceremony also stood up with a smile. The huge hall of Kunlun was filled with clamor. Countless gazes of envy, joy, and jealousy were looking at Lu Qin. Perfected Lord Tianlan pulled Lu Qin to the front row and introduced his disciple to the 5 high and mighty divine transformation realm perfected lords one by one. The 5 of them smiled and agreed. Then they each took out a gift for Lu Qin. Lu Qin wore a smile and a respectful expression, looking like the most honest and humble young man. He greeted the 5 seniors with a smile and flattered them before accepting the gifts one by one. With the help of the divine transformation realm perfected lords, Lu Qin's current identity was completely different. Not only was he a disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan, he had also obtained the inheritance of the Heaven Dao name that perfected Lord Tianlan had announced to the world. Almost all the cultivators present knew what this meant. In the thousands of years of history of the Kunlun party, almost all the people who inherited this Dao name would become influential figures in the future. Out of 10, 70 to 80% of them would become the sect leader of the Kunlun party, which was much more important than the personal disciples of ordinary sections. Therefore, these divine transformation realm perfected lords should have also understood the reason behind this. Or perhaps they were giving face to perfected Lord Tianlan, who was currently at the peak of his power. The gifts they gave were truly extraordinary. Although they could not be said to be at the level of the extremely rare heavenly treasures, they were all exquisite and precious items that made people drool. One must know that they were basically giving them away for free. As the gifts appeared one after another and were accepted by Lu Qin without the slightest hesitation with a damned humble smile, the praises from the crowd could be said to come wave after wave, and the gazes of envy, jealousy, and hatred were like rolling waves. Of course there was also hee among them, but basically, there was only a bone-deep hatred left. After meeting the 5 divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, perfected Lord Tianlan actually went through the trouble of leading Lu Qin to the seats of the perfected cultivators 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 of the perfected cultivator alliance. This caused another uproar, and also let everyone see once again how much perfected Lord Tianlan doted on this disciple. In the future, if there were conflicts in daily life, they would probably give in to Lu Qin a little more. Well, by the way, don't think that you don't need to give a gift just because you are Yuanying realm perfected Lord. Lu Qin still had a smile on his face and his expression was gentle. When he was pulled around by his master perfected Lord Tianlan to greet the smiling seniors around him, his etiquette was simply impeccable. Except for a certain gap in the middle, when he seemed to maintain a smile while gently gritting his teeth, and said in a low voice that only perfected Lord Tianlan could hear, "I say, don't go too far. These people have never thought of giving you a gift, okay?" Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have not heard him at all. With a smile on his face, he continued to pull Lu Qin forward as if he had not heard him. At the same time, he said in a low voice without batting an eyelid, "Are you stupid? I will only accept you as my disciple in my life. If I don't accept more, how can I face myself?" Lu Qin. Chapter 467. Lu Qin, come and greet Perfected Long Tai. Perfected Lord Tianlan pulled Lu Qin to a square-faced and majestic Yuanying Perfected Master. He first smiled and nodded at Perfected Long Tai. Perfected Long Tai didn't dare to be rude to him and hurriedly bowed with a smile. Perfected Lord Tianlan then turned to Lu Qin and said, Perfected Long Tai is a famous figure in Zhangxianming. In the Heavenly Law Hall, he is the most upright person and has always been respected by his peers. This was a praise from a famous soul formation perfected lord who could even be considered the #1 person in Zhangxianming. Even though Perfected Long Tai wasn't on the same side as Fuyunji, he couldn't help but smile and thank him profusely. Lu Qin walked over obediently and greeted him with the etiquette of a junior. Then he respectfully called Perfected Lord Tianlan martial uncle. Perfected Long Tai was delighted at first and then shocked. He hurriedly shook his head and said, Nephew, you can't do this. I don't dare to be on the same level as Perfected Lord. In the past I've always done the etiquette of a junior. How can I go overboard today? Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't care and laughed. He's a young man. It's only right for him to respect you as a senior. Today is a joyous day. Long Tai, you don't have to worry about it. Ah. Perfected Lord Tianlan's laughter was hearty and righteous. Instantly it attracted a wave of flattery. They all said that Perfected Lord Tianlan was broad-minded and had an imposing appearance. Perfected Long Tai couldn't help but nod and laugh. Then his gaze fell on Lu Qin. He nodded and said seriously, I see that nephew Lu Qin is talented and outstanding. You're truly a dragon among men. In the future I will study hard and train hard under you. In time I will definitely become a hero of my righteous Tao Immortal Alliance. As he spoke, he reached into his clothes and took out a jade bottle with a 5-petal red plum drawn on it. Under everyone's gaze, Perfected Long Tai's eyes flashed with a hint of pain. But then his expression returned to normal. He stuffed the jade bottle into Lu Qin's hand and smiled. This is a superior grade spirit pill called Red Plum. It's most effective for meridian and internal injuries. As long as your heart isn't completely shattered, taking this pill will save your life. It'll be a little more protection when you roam the pugilistic world. The crowd in Kunlun Palace was stirred. Many knew how precious the Red Plum Spirit Pill was, but almost no one expected it to be Long Tailan to be so generous. Earlier on, when Perfected Lord Tianlan brought Lu Qin to meet a few nascent soul-perfected beings, the gifts they gave were considered ordinary. Of course, this was only for perfected Yuanying. At least for ordinary cultivators, the gifts from those Yuanying perfected lords were already precious. Looking at the Red Plum Spirit Pill in his hand, Lu Qin was shocked. He looked a little uneasy and didn't dare to accept it directly. Instead he turned to look at Perfected Lord Tian. However, what kind of person was Perfected Lord Tianlan? With one look he could tell that the kid was gripping the jade bottle tightly and had no intention of letting go. Perfected Lord Tian coughed and clapped his hands. Lu Qin, why aren't you thanking Perfected Long Tai for his kindness? In the future all of us will be in the true Immortal Alliance and we will be one family. Today we have formed a relationship and there will be karma in the future. You must remember this in your heart. As he spoke, he even smiled and reached out to pat and lighten Long Tai's shoulder, nodding to him. Lu Qin nodded and bowed to Perfected Long Tai solemnly. Thank you, Uncle Master. A trace of joy flashed across Perfected Long Tai's eyes as he nodded with a smile. It was only then that the people at the side came to their senses and thought, so that's what's going on. Perfected Lord Tianlan is a powerful and prestigious perfected lord of the soul formation realm. If he were to give out an ordinary gift, wouldn't it be akin to slapping Perfected Lord Tianlan in the face if it was a slightly lower grade gift? I'm holding a disciple recruitment ceremony. On such an important and solemn occasion, you brought a broken thing over. Are you trying to disgust me? Are you looking down on me? Are you going to slap my face? Are you dissatisfied with a divine transformation stage perfected lord like me? Or do you want to go against me? *CK. There was no way to think about what happened next. It was supposed to be a joyous day. They happily came to the palace of Kunlun to congratulate perfected Lord Tian and form a bond with a divine transformation stage perfected lord. But if they gave too little gift, wouldn't the bond become an enemy? Who would have thought that perfected Long Tai, who usually looked old-fashioned and upright, would think deeper than everyone else today? For a moment, everyone looked at Perfected Long Tai differently. Perfected Long Tai, on the other hand, revealed a pleased expression as he took a step back and stood among the crowd. After a while, many people present thought of another matter. It was the few nascent soul-perfected ones with relatively ordinary gifts that perfected Lord Tianlan brought Lu Qin to see just now. Sure enough, at a glance, the 3 or 4 nascent soul-stage Taoist masters all looked extremely ugly. Their faces were green and white. Among them, there was an impatient one who was already glaring at Taoist master Long Tai angrily, looking like he was gnashing his teeth. Perfected Long Tai didn't care about this at all. He didn't even bother to look at them. Was this a joke? That was an outstanding peak perfected lord. His influence was so great that no one in Zhengxianming could compare to him. Instead of forming a bond they would offend him? Go to hell. Compared to that, offending you Yuanying perfected lords is nothing. Anyway, everyone was in the Yuanying realm. Who's afraid of who? With Taoist master Long Tai's good start, the situation immediately changed. Wherever perfected Lord Tian Tian and Lu Qin went, there would be cheers and laughter. Come Lu Qin, this is perfected Meng Shan. Greetings martial uncle Meng Shan. Aha, no need to be so courteous. Sai, nephew Lu Qin has an excellent aptitude. Congratulations to perfected lord for getting such a good disciple. This is the first time we meet. I have a treasure called Ice Crystal Stone. It came from a 10,000-year-old ice cap. It is a rare item, please accept it. Lu Qin, come over. Greetings perfected Huang Tan. Greetings martial uncle Huang Tan. Ah, nephew need not be so courteous. TSK, nephew Lu Qin is young and handsome. Now you are married. Ha, young man, don't say a few words and I will be embarrassed. Come, this is the first time we meet. This King Wu hook, that can cut through gold and jade is a greeting gift. Come, this is perfected Tong Shan. Haha, this is perfected Yan Zhao. Come quickly Lu Qin, come and greet this person. She is not an ordinary person, she is the famous celestial Chui Wei. And this is perfected by Sha. In the end, the people of the Floating Clouds office were the ones who were smart. Shuang made a gesture without batting an eyelid. Old Ma, who was beside her, ran over like a wisp of smoke. He held an extremely large and solemn red wooden tray in his hand and began following Lu Qin and true Lord Tianlan step by step. Lu Qin took one and put another on the wooden plate. There was no other way. He couldn't just put it into the tree hole in front of everyone, right? Therefore he could only trouble old Ma to carry the plate. Furthermore, one plate could not fit all of them. After all, there were big and small treasures. After filling it up, old Ma ran back and put it away. Then he took another plate and ran over. For a moment he attracted the attention of many people. Why did it seem like Fuyunji's preparations were very thorough? Chapter 468. Unknowingly, the atmosphere in the main hall of the Kunlun slowly became a little strange. Most of the people who could stand here today were cultivators with status or roots in Zhengxianming. Since they had status in Zhengxianming, they were also a group of elites in the vast land of Shenzhou. Most of the people who could reach such a position were smart people, and some things could naturally be seen by those who were observant. However, most of the people seemed to be unaware of this. Everyone was amiable and polite. Wherever perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin went, there was a sea of joy and flattery. Only the 5 big shots who were also perfected lords of the divine transformation realm behind them had a slightly different expression from the rest. Some frowned slightly, some smiled with slight disdain, and of course, there were also some who seemed to be smiling as if they could not help laughing. After walking around like this, perfected Lord Tianlan brought Lu Qin to meet a large number of Yuanying Zenrens. Old Ma, who was following behind, received gifts until his hands were sore, but he was unusually excited. This guy had probably never seen so many rare treasures in his life, and his eyes were almost dazzled. Seeing that there was only one last group of people left, when perfected Lord Tianlan led Lu Qin to that side, he did not stop in front of the few Yuanying Zenrens in front of the crowd this time. Instead, he nodded at them with a smile and walked forward. The people next to him were stunned, but after taking a closer look at the crowd, they came to their senses. It turned out that the people standing there were all people from the Kunlun party. It seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan was a little embarrassed to attack his own people after all. After seeing perfected Lord Tianlan's action, the few Yuanying Zenrens of the Kunlun party were obviously relieved and a smile appeared on their faces. After all, they were from the same sect as perfected Lord Tianlan. If perfected Lord Tianlan really brought Lu Qin to meet them, not only would they have to give him a greeting gift, but because of this relationship they would most likely give him a better gift than the others. Seeing that things were as such, perfected Lord Tianlan was about to walk past the Zenrens of the Kunlun party with Lu Qin. Unexpectedly, at this moment, Lu Qin, who had been quietly following behind perfected Lord Tianlan and had never overstepped the rules for so long, suddenly turned around and actually left perfected Lord Tianlan behind. He took a few steps forward and bowed to one of the few Yuanying Zenrens of the Kunlun party. With a smile on his face, he said very politely and respectfully, "Greetings, Uncle Master." There was a sudden commotion in the crowd. Many gazes looked over curiously, including perfected Lord Tianlan who was walking in front, who also looked back in surprise. At the end of everyone's line of sight, the person who stood in front of Lu Qin with a stunned expression was Masato Kihara of the Kunlun party. In the crowd, Su Qingjun, who was originally standing behind Masato Kihara with a slightly complicated expression, suddenly saw Lu Qin like this. For a moment she was also a little surprised and subconsciously took a step forward. Although Masato Kihara was stunned, she was after all a Jinren of the Yuanying Jinren who had cultivated for many years. She had both bearing and experience, so she quickly adjusted herself and laughed. She quickly reached out to help Lu Qin up and said with a smile, "Brother Lu, you can't do this. Usually when I see your master in the same sect, I also greet him as a junior and call him Uncle Master. From now on, you and I can just treat each other as equals." Lu Qin smiled and nodded. Perfected Lord Tianlan, who was next to him, walked over. He did not seem to be angry but found it a little funny. Perhaps he was thinking to himself, "Is this guy actually more cunning than me? He even dares to lay his hands on his own people." At the same time he was also a little curious as to why this disciple of his did not look for anyone else but this Masato Kihara. One must know that in this hall today the Uncle Master, that Lu Qin called out was the most valuable. After half a day who knew how many treasures he had swindled? Many people understood this logic. Of course Masato Kihara could also see it. For a moment, his face was a little bitter and he laughed dryly. At this moment he naturally recognized Lu Qin's appearance. Back then outside Su Qingjuan's cave abode, he had also come into contact with Lu Qin. Therefore he leaned forward slightly and his expression did not change. However, he lowered his voice and said, "Little Lu, on this big day of yours, why are you staring at me instead of others?" Su Qingjun stood beside her master and heard this sentence clearly. She frowned slightly and looked at Lu Qin with some unfriendliness, as if there was a little anger. Lu Qin also lowered his head slightly and then said in a low voice, "Uncle Master, that year outside the Qingjun sect, you promised to give me something. You haven't given it to me yet." Apart from Su Qingjun, there was also perfected Lord Tianlan who heard this conversation. At this moment, he raised his brows slightly and looked as if he was going to scold Lu Qin and take him away. Suddenly, he steadied himself and then looked at Masato Kihara with a smile that was not a smile. His smile was full of playfulness. Sweat immediately dripped down Masato Kihara's face. Standing at the side, Su Qingjun was also stunned for a moment. Then, as if she thought of something, the corners of her mouth twitched and she seemed to almost laugh out loud. However, she immediately came to her senses and immediately held back her laughter. When she looked at Lu Qin again, she found that he was also looking at her, intentionally or unintentionally. Their gazes met in mid-air. Su Qingjun gently gritted her teeth, glared at him, and then turned her head away. After a moment, Masato Kihara coughed and laughed. "Brother Lu is too polite. Today is your big day. With a famous teacher like Uncle Master Tianlan, your future is boundless. You will definitely be the pillar of the new generation of our Kunlun party." As he said this, he paused for a moment and stretched out a hand to touch his body. The surrounding crowd immediately burst into laughter. It wasn't entirely out of mockery, it was just that this matter seemed rather amusing. However, it was obvious that Masato Kihara was a little unprepared for the current situation. Although he had said the polite words, when his hand touched his body, his movements were slow. It seemed that he had not thought about what gift to give. Outsiders might not understand, but most people in the Kunlun party knew that Masato Kihara was born in Tieji, and his resources were not as rich as the Kunlun party. It was only in recent years that he clung to the thigh of perfected Lord Tianlan that his life slowly got better. But it was also because of this that he could not show his timidity when perfected Lord Tianlan was looking at him with a faint smile. Just as he was cursing Lu Qin in his heart and was about to bleed with heartache, suddenly Su Qingjun beside him took a step forward and put a small box in his hand. Masato Kihara was shocked. Before he could react, he heard Su Qingjun say calmly, "This is the famous tea little crane. It is unique to the E family of Kunlun Mountain's tea-growing family. Can calm the mind and is quite effective for cultivating qi. There is only a small amount produced every year, and it is only given to those who are fated." After saying that, she did not look at Lu Qin. She lowered her eyes and took a step back, standing behind Masato Kihara again. Family little crane. The smile on Lu Chen's face suddenly disappeared. After a while, he suddenly sighed softly and muttered to himself in a low voice, "Are we fated?" He shook his head and his expression suddenly seemed a little bleak. He then took the tea from the startled Masato Kihara's hand, bowed to him solemnly and turned to walk forward. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled slightly and also turned to leave. Behind him, Su Qingjuan's bright eyes glimmered with a trace of pain and gentleness. She quietly glanced at Lu Chen's back. Chapter 469. This clamorous and lively disciple acceptance ceremony that shook the entire immortal city finally came to an end before dusk arrived. Everyone left with a satisfied and joyful smile, walking out of the majestic Kunlun Hall and dispersing in all directions. When night fell, the Kunlun Hall finally regained its silence. Looking out from the hall and through the door, one could see a bright moon slowly rising, radiating a bright and gentle light that shone on the mortal world. At this moment there were only 2 people left in the huge hall. When there was no one around, Perfected Lord Tianlan casually sat on the ground, gazing at the bright moon in the distant night sky with a deep gaze. Beside him, Lu Chen also sat quietly, but he did not look at the moonlight outside. Instead, he was staring at an unknown dark corner in the hall, lost in thought. Not far behind the 2 of them, under the white lotus throne, on the tall and wide wooden table, all kinds of rare treasures were piled up like a mountain, to the point that the table could no longer hold them all. They slid down like worthless sand and piled up around the table, forming a treasure mountain that could make most cultivators in the world go crazy with envy. However, the 2 of them did not seem to be among the majority of the cultivators, because from the beginning to the end, Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen did not look back at the treasure mountain. This silence lasted for a long time. Suddenly, at a certain moment, Lu Chen broke the silence and said, "Hey, let me ask you something." Perfected Lord Tianlan replied with a "Hmm." Lu Chen said, "Did you want to take me in as your disciple when you took me in and nurtured me when I was young?" Perfected Lord Tianlan retracted his gaze from the moonlight and turned to look at Lu Chen, saying, "No." Lu Chen asked, "Why?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, "What you wanted to do back then was too dangerous. Even I couldn't guarantee your safety. Moreover, it seemed that after you sneaked into the devil cult, you would most likely die. So, you see, I can't possibly place all my hopes on a person who can die at any time, right?" Lu Chen sighed and said, "In any case, today is the first day I formally acknowledged you as my master. You don't have to be so straightforward with your words." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled warmly and said, "Apart from being with you all these years, it's rare for me to be able to speak freely. I'll take this opportunity to say a few more words. I'm delighted to see you suffer." Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said grumpily, "You are a famous divine transformation stage perfected cultivator. Why are you acting like a resentful woman? Do you have to do this?" Perfected Lord Tianlan burst into laughter and looked delighted. When Supreme Tianlan's laughter stopped, Lu Chen looked at him and said, "Well, no matter what, I've taken you as my master. What do you need me to do next?" Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flickered as if he was curious. He looked at his disciple with a smile and said, "That's strange. If other people were to become a disciple of a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator, needless to say, the first thing they would do would be to obtain various cultivation resources from their master and cultivate to their heart's content. It would take at least a few years and at most a dozen years. If they don't improve their cultivation to the Jin Dan Yuanying realm, they would be too embarrassed to tell others that they are the disciple of a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator. Why is it that when it comes to you, you don't even think about cultivation and the first thing you want to do is to help me?" Lu Chen's expression was indifferent and did not seem to be affected. He said, "That's for others. The situation is different. You are not those other perfected cultivators and I am not those people." Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him for a moment and then nodded. He seemed to be a little emotional, but he did not dwell on this matter. Then he asked calmly, "Then can I trust you completely, Tianing?" Lu Chen sat where he was and didn't answer immediately. His expression was a little strange. He didn't know if it was because of the sudden call, or if it was because of the high and mighty person in front of him saying the word believe. After a long time, Lu Chen raised his head and met Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze. He nodded and said calmly, "Sure." He said calmly, "You can trust me. The Kunlun party has dispatched many people recently. Almost all of them have arrived at Immortal City." In the quiet hall of Kunlun, Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen sat side by side. Their voices were so soft that only the two of them could hear them. This group of people includes the other experts of the Kunlun party. Together with Fuyunji, they are the two strongest forces under me. If I want to do something big, I must integrate these two forces. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Qin and said, but it is not that easy. Although both sides listen to me, it will be troublesome to integrate them. Shuiying is very capable, but the Kunlun party is very biased and may not be willing to submit to her. So I need someone to mediate between them, and this person is none other than you. Lu Qin nodded silently. He had no objections to this. Regardless of anything else, he was the only disciple and successor of perfected Lord Tianlan. This was enough for the experts of the Kunlun party to acknowledge him. Moreover, he had been in the shadow of Fuyunji for at least 20 years. He was very familiar with Fuyunji. Therefore Lu Qin did not reject this. He nodded and said, okay, I will do my best. When perfected Lord Tianlan saw that he promised so readily, a hint of gratification flashed across his face. He nodded and said, don't worry, when it's time to support you, I'll definitely do so. Also, I won't treat you badly. At the very least, I'll let you have the strength to fight against a nascent soul-perfected master. Lu Qin smiled and suddenly asked, can I trust you? Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned. Of course. Why do you suddenly ask this? Lu Qin looked into his eyes and said, then you said you wanted to do something big. What is it? Perfected Lord Tianlan said without hesitation, you know me. For so many years, my top priority has been to completely annihilate the devil cult. Therefore your next task is to mediate between the two parties. You will command and pursue the remaining members of the devil cult and try to completely destroy this tumor. Lu Qin nodded and said, I understand. What else? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him for a while and suddenly smiled. What else? What are you referring to? Lu Qin did not smile. He only looked at him quietly. The bright moon outside the hall finally rose into the night sky. The shadows on the ground gradually became shorter and blurred. The mountain of treasures behind them also quietly disappeared into the darkness. The surrounding was silent. The smile on perfected Lord Tianlan's face gradually disappeared. He looked at Lu Qin indifferently. His gaze gradually turned from gentle to deep and boundless, like the ocean with faint waves rising and falling. Why do you ask me this? When perfected Lord Tianlan spoke again, his voice was still deep and thick. However, there seemed to be a hint of thunder in it. Chapter 470. The hall was silent for a long time until Lu Qin's voice rang out, I've been in the devil cult for too long and I know them better than anyone else. Although the devil cult has a great reputation and is very ferocious, and there are still some demonic remnants appearing from time to time, but after the Battle of the Desolate Valley more than 10 years ago, they have more or less collapsed. Collapsed? But don't forget that Elder Ghost is still on the run. Even though we have annihilated their lair in the Immortal City Underground Palace a few days ago, he still escaped. Perfected Lord Tianlan asked. Lu Qin said indifferently, he alone is useless. In history the devil cult had countless even more outstanding geniuses, but in the end, they still inevitably weakened. This is not the key point. Oh, then what is the key point? Tell me. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be interested, and his gaze became calmer. There was even a hint of admiration in his eyes. These complicated and intertwined emotions made him look like a terrifying dragon that was constantly changing its expression. He was hard to fathom. Lu Qin was probably the only person in this world who could speak bluntly in front of this dragon. Or perhaps it was because he strangely maintained an inexplicable calmness. Their foundation has been destroyed. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flickered. What foundation? People. Lu Qin said calmly, the key to the devil cult spreading its teachings and absorbing new blood to expand and strengthen is that they need many new people, which is the countless ordinary people in the world. As long as there are people who believe in their nonsense, then no matter what kind of setbacks the devil cult encounters, there will be a day where they will rise again. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded, indeed. In the past, there were some peerless geniuses in the world's righteous path who almost annihilated the devil cult. But as time passed, these evildoers could always rise again. Since the devil cult is so difficult to destroy, why are you so sure now? Because there has never been a Zhang Xianmeng before. Lu Qin looked at him and said, in the past, no matter how powerful the geniuses of the righteous path were, they were just people who defied the natural order. At most they had the power of a sect or sect. But now, Zhang Xianmeng controls the cultivation world and his influence covers the whole world. Almost everyone is under the control of the Immortal Alliance. As time goes by, everyone will hear what Zhang Xianming has announced. They will know that the nonsense of the devil cult cannot be trusted, and it will be harder for them to recruit new blood. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. Lu Qin sighed and said, "So what if there's Elder Gue? They're still facing a dead end in the end. There's no way out. We're destined to perish." Perfected Lord Tianlan patted his knee gently, looking somewhat relieved. "Thank you for your auspicious words. I hope so." Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, "This is the general trend and it won't change anymore. It's just that many people don't understand the devil cult well, so they haven't reacted yet." He raised his head and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. "However, you're different. Just like me, you've been dealing with this bunch of monster incarnates for decades. I'm sure you'll be able to understand what I can see as well. So I find it strange that the devil cult is just a facade now. You don't need to mobilize a large number of experts from the Kunlun party to help at all. Just the power of Fuyunji alone is enough to destroy them." Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a moment and said, "What you said makes some sense." Lu Qin said, "So other than the devil cult, what else do you want to do?" At this moment, his expression was unusually serious. He frowned and said, "I once infiltrated the devil cult and risked my life for you. I helped you do things and risked my life for you. This is nothing. But I want to know what exactly you want to do?" When Perfected Lord Tianlan heard the first sentence, his expression was still a little uncertain. However, when he heard the words of risking his life, his body trembled slightly as if his heart had been touched. His gaze slowly turned gentle. After a while he waved his hand lightly. Lu Qin immediately stood up and walked to his side with light footsteps. He then squatted down quietly. Perfected Lord Tianlan started to whisper in his ear. His voice was so low that only Lu Qin could hear it. He listened quietly and remained expressionless from the beginning to the end. The moonlight outside the hall finally moved out of this place, leaving behind complete darkness that was as deep as the sea. Since the birth of Zhang Xianming, there was probably no one like Lu Qin who suddenly rose to the sky in one night. From an unknown person he suddenly rose to the clouds and became an influential person with great power. Of course, this power came from the huge backing of Perfected Lord Tianlan. But it was also because of Perfected Lord Tianlan's strong and determined attitude that he directly gave Lu Qin incredible power. It showed that he valued this disciple very much and was determined to cultivate him with all his strength. In fact, Lu Qin became the leader of the experts dispatched from the Kunlun party. He was also responsible for negotiating with Shui Ying, the famous hall master of Fuyunji, about the arrangement of the two parties' forces. At the same time he also began to intervene in everything related to the devil cult. He could ask about anything related to the devil cult. These two appointments alone were enough to make Lu Qin one of the most popular upstarts in Zhang Xianming. At the same time he also controlled an unimaginably huge amount of resources in Zhang Xianming. No one dared to take him lightly. Because now, whenever Lu Qin went out and introduced himself, he would say with great emotion, "I am Lu Qin, Taoist named Tianing." "What? You don't care about Tianing? Then can you please go and talk to Perfected Lord Tianlan?" There were too many smart people in Zhang Xianming. They had sharp eyes and could see the situation clearly. Everyone could see that Perfected Lord Tianlan, who was the most powerful person in Zhang Xianming, probably really wanted to cultivate his new disciple this time. As for the other big shots under his command who had already been famous for many years, Thousand Lantern Immortal was far away in Kunlun as the sect leader immortal and was out of his reach. Shuiying was in charge of Fuyunji and had great power. However, she had suffered a heavy setback from the devil cult a few days ago. The outside world was saying that Perfected Lord Tianlan was dissatisfied with her. Besides, you are just a subordinate. How can you be compared with Lu Qin, a direct disciple with an inherited Taoist name? Perhaps Shuiying herself had also recognized this reality. So when Lu Qin came to her and asked for the dozen devil cult captives he had captured in the underground palace, Shuiying agreed without hesitation, even though it was Fuyunji's biggest responsibility to interrogate and deal with the devil cult for the past few decades. Her straightforwardness even surprised Lu Qin a little, but Lu Qin did not care too much. In fact, he just came to Fuyunji for a trip. For many years, the prison of Fuyunji had been the safest place to imprison dangerous members of the devil cult. For so many years, no one had ever escaped, so Lu Qin did not want to cause trouble. Outside the prison of Fuyunji, while waiting for those people in front to go through the complicated and tedious procedures to open the door, Lu Qin looked back and saw a man and a woman following behind him. The man was still old Ma, But the woman was not White Lotus who had been with them for the past few days. Instead it was Su Qingjun. At this moment, Su Qingjun did not have much of an expression on her face, but when she occasionally looked at Lu Qin, her eyes were a little complicated. She probably grew up in a quiet and peaceful environment of an aristocratic family and had never seen a man like him who insisted on using power to transfer her here. However, at this time Lu Qin did not look at her. Instead, he frowned slightly as if remembering something. He asked old Ma in a low voice, "Where is White Lotus? Why haven't I seen her recently?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "I don't know either. It seems that since that day at Horse Washing Bridge, she has been hiding from us and refused to come over." Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said in a low voice, "Is she angry?" Chapter 471. Why is she angry? The one who asked this question was Su Qingjun, who had been standing silently at the side. She was from the Kunlun party and had met White Lotus before. Although she had just arrived in Immortal City and did not know much about the entanglement between White Lotus, Lu Qin and Old Ma in the past, she heard that Lu Qin and Old Ma's words were a little strange. She was also a smart and sensitive woman, so she asked directly. Lu Qin was stunned and did not know what to say for a moment. He looked at Old Ma. Old Ma also shrugged and turned his head, obviously not wanting to answer this question. Lu Qin was a little helpless. After thinking for a moment, he whispered to Su Qingjun, "Old Ma and I guessed it privately. She probably thought that she would become the bald head's disciple." Old Ma stood at the side and listened. Suddenly, his heart moved slightly and he glanced at Lu Qin. In the words just now, it seemed inconspicuous, but Old Ma and Lu Qin had been together for many years, so he still heard something strange in it. For many years, Lu Qin had called perfected Lord Tianlan, "damn bald head," behind his back, but now the word "die" was quietly missing. Su Qingjun naturally did not notice this, but she was still surprised by Lu Qin's words. She said in astonishment, "Wasn't White Lotus the disciple of Hakushin Jinkuin? Why would she think of—" Lu Qin shook his head and said, "Not everyone thinks the same as you." With that, he roughly told Su Qingjun about what had happened to White Lotus these days. After listening, Su Qingjun was silent at first, and then she shook her head gently with some pity on her face. She said, "It seems that White Lotus is a little pitiful. At a young age, her master unfortunately passed away before she succeeded in her cultivation. Now she has been taken to stay with Martial Granduncle Tianlan. Maybe she just wants to find someone to rely on." Pitiful. Lu Qin seemed to disagree with Su Qingjun's comment. He said, "That little girl is much more powerful than you think. Don't underestimate her and don't sympathize with her. Otherwise you will suffer a big loss in the future." Su Qingjun glanced at Lu Qin with slight surprise and said, "What's wrong with you? You're actually so harsh to a little girl?" Lu Qin was speechless for a moment. It was no wonder that Su Qingjun would behave like this. Indeed, when White Lotus was on Kunlun Mountain in the past, except in front of him, she would show a fierce side. In front of others, she was quiet and peaceful. It seemed that she had really deceived a lot of people. At this time, the door of the prison in front of them opened. Lu Qin did not want to continue on this topic, so he greeted them and walked inside. Su Qingjun seemed to be a little concerned about the relationship between Lu Qin and White Lotus. It seemed that she wanted to say something more. When she took a few steps forward, she suddenly saw Lu Qin turn back and suddenly smile at her. His smile was a little strange. Su Qingjun was a little surprised and said, "Why do you look at me like this?" Lu Qin said with a smile, "I thought of a very funny thing. The seniority between us is like a mess. When we were on Kunlun Mountain, didn't you accept me as a registered disciple? Now here your master Masato Kihara has to call Tianlan martial uncle. Then you will become a junior to me, won't you?" Su Qingjun thought it was true. She snorted and walked forward grumpily saying, "Don't expect me to call you martial uncle." Interrupted by him, Su Qingjun forgot what she wanted to ask White Lotus. As for Lu Qin, he smiled and walked into the dark cell with her. Most of the cells in the world were dark and depressing because they were a place to imprison people and make them lose their freedom. It was a place where countless pains were created. Almost no one liked to stay here. No matter the prisoners or the people who were themselves free. Su Qingjun didn't like this kind of place either, so she was surprised and puzzled that Lu Qin specifically asked her to come here. But she was not a rebellious person. In fact, for so many years, although she carried the name of a genius, she basically didn't do anything too rebellious, whether in her family or in her sect. So she still came here. She was a good daughter in the eyes of everyone in her family. She was a genius disciple in the eyes of her master. Her cultivation was brave and vigorous. It seemed that her life would be smooth sailing according to people's expectations, and she might not even encounter a few big storms. At least so far, Su Qingjuan's life was almost like this. The reason why it was more or less the same was because a few years ago, she had also encountered a huge accident and witnessed the death of her younger brother. The past became a knife hidden in everyone's hearts. From time to time, when they thought of it, they would be cut, which made people feel a little sad. Lu Qin led Su Qingjun forward and from time to time introduced the situation in a low voice to her. As for old Ma, he had been following behind them, his eyes vigilantly looking at the cells around them. This prison was specially set up by the Fuyun office to imprison the evildoers of the devil cult. After so many years of blood feud, of course the Fuyun office would not be courteous to these mortal enemies. Therefore this prison was very dirty, very messy, very dark, and very smelly. It was very much like the dark place in those stories where all the evildoers gathered. It was very disgusting. The prison cells on both sides of the road, other than the hard and wide stone walls, were almost all surrounded by iron bars as thick as a wrist. Most of the prisoners locked up here, which were the evil cult's evil people and captives, all looked lifeless. They hid in the dark corners of the cells as if they were afraid of the light. Occasionally they would look with hatred or with completely numb eyes at the figures who had just passed by, sitting motionless in the dark. The surroundings were quiet, but this dark prison looked unusually scary. There was even a faint feeling of deprivation of humanity, making people tremble with fear and especially disgusted. Both Lu Qin and old Ma were indifferent to the uncomfortable situation in this prison. They indifferently walked forward as if they did not feel anything around them. Only Su Qingjuan's expression turned uglier as she walked. Especially when she gradually went deeper into the prison. Slowly she saw more and more terrible mirror images. Her face started to turn pale. In the cells in the depths of the prison, the prisoners locked up were obviously of a higher status, and their cultivation was also stronger. However, more countermeasures had also appeared. Some were chained up, some wore heavy shackles, and some were covered in blood. There were obvious signs of torture, and they looked very miserable. Most of the prisoners here looked very weak. They were groaning in pain, gasping for breath, as if they were the weak and tiny souls in this demonic prison. As they continued to walk forward, when they were about to reach the deepest part of the prison, Su Qingjun suddenly stopped. Her face turned abnormally pale, even bloodless. Because here, in the cell that she had just passed, she inadvertently saw a prisoner in an even more miserable state. It was a man with missing limbs. This man's right arm and left arm were cut off by sharp blades. His left leg seemed to be a little limp, his face covered with weeds like a beard. When Lu Qin and the others walked over, this man seemed to be unaware of what was happening outside. He was just trying to drink water. There was a broken bowl on the ground, there was some dirty water in it. He knelt on the ground and stretched his neck, like a dog trying to put his face into the broken bowl to drink. Su Qingjun seemed to be unable to bear it anymore. She suddenly grabbed Lu Qin, her face pale, pointing at the man in the cell. Even her voice was slightly trembling as she asked, This man, what did he do wrong to be treated like this?" Chapter 472. The passage of the prison immediately quietened down. Not only Lu Qin and old Ma's side, but also the prison guards who were leading the way and following behind. One must know that the most important prisoners in Fuyunji were imprisoned here. Every one of them was an evildoer of the devil cult, a great enemy with a blood feud. Of course, Fuyunji attached great importance to them. Therefore, even though Lu Qin's status was different now, the prison guards here could not really let the three of them walk in as they pleased. There were quite a number of guards accompanying them, but Lu Qin's identity as the disciple of Supreme Tianlan was still powerful, so everyone gave him some face and walked a little further away. At this moment, when they suddenly heard Su Qingjun say such words, and her tone was urgent, there seemed to be some indignation. Before Lu Qin and old Ma could react, several cold gazes swept over them. Lu Qin frowned slightly and said, "Those are the evildoers of the devil cult." Of course, those who were imprisoned in this prison were the remaining evildoers of the devil cult who had been fighting with Fuyunji for decades. Su Qingjun also knew this in her heart, but there was still some reluctance and anger in her expression. But as intelligent as she was, she quickly felt that the surrounding prison guards were looking at them with unfriendly gazes. Su Qingjun gritted her teeth and seemed to be a little hesitant, but in the end she could not help but say, "I know they are evildoers of the devil cult. I won't say anything if you kill them, but such humiliation and torture, isn't it too much?" Lu Qin nodded, and then suddenly waved to one of the prison guards who was standing a little further behind. That person quickly walked over, bowed to Lu Qin and said, "Young master, what's the matter?" Lu Qin was startled for a moment. He probably didn't expect the guard to call him young master. However, this wasn't the time to worry about this. In any case, it was probably because he didn't have a public position yet, so it wasn't appropriate for others to call him that. Therefore, he didn't say much and just asked, "I haven't asked for your name yet." The prison guard said, "I dare not. My surname is Qin and my name is Guy." Lu Qin nodded and then said to him calmly, "Can you tell the senior sister of the Kunlun party about the prisoner's situation?" Qin Guy straightened up, glanced at Lu Qin and then turned to Su Qingjun, expressionlessly pointed to the prisoner in the prison and said, "This person is called Shang Fei, originally an altar master of the devil cult in the Western land. He has done many evil deeds and committed many bloody crimes. We caught him 2 years ago and locked him up here." At this time, old Ma, who was standing at the side, suddenly made a sound of surprise, but no one noticed him. Only Lu Qin glanced at him out of the corner of his eye, and found that old Ma was looking at the mutilated devil cult prisoner through the iron bars. Lu Qin did not care about him and quickly continued to ask Qin Guy, "What's the matter with the injuries on his body?" Qin Guy said, "Some of them are injuries from when we first arrested him, and some are from when we interrogated him." A trace of anger flashed across Su Qingjuan's face and she said, "We, the Zhengxian Meng, are the leaders of the world's righteous faction. How can we—" Before she could finish her words, several gazes from the side, including Qin Gai's, became a little unhappy. Lu Qin shook his head and after a moment of silence he said to Qin Gai, "This Shiji Su, she probably did not know about those things before, so please forgive her." Qin Gai nodded slowly and his expression softened a little. At the same time, he seemed to feel that the atmosphere here was inexplicably tense, and waved to the surrounding people. Those cold gazes immediately left and everyone seemed to be relieved. Lu Qin said again, "How about this, can I trouble you to tell Shiji Su what this person has done?" Su Qingjun was stunned for a moment, and her heart skipped a beat. She had a faint feeling that something was not right. Qin Gai, who was in front, did not hesitate too much. After nodding slightly to Lu Qin he said, "This Shang Fei is the altar master of the devil cult. He looks gentle on the surface but in fact he is an extremely violent demon. The number of people killed by him adds up to at least 100, and as for the murders committed by the devil cult demons under his command, it is innumerable. Moreover, this person is vicious by nature. He often tortured his captives and even skinned them. Several of our brothers in Fuyunji died in his hands." Su Qingjuan's face gradually turned pale. At the end of the story Qin Gai turned around, looked at her and said, "Miss Su, you are the proud daughter of a famous sect, so you probably don't understand these dirty and disgusting things. But in this place these people deserve it. You don't have to plead for them." Lu Qin walked over from the side, looked at Su Qingjuan's unusually ugly face, and did not say anything. He only whispered a few words in Qin Gai's ear. Qin Gai turned back to look at him and then nodded. It seemed that he agreed. Lu Qin cupped his hands to show his gratitude. Then they continued to walk forward. Qin Gai seemed to be a chatterbox and walked in front of everyone. Every time they passed by a cell he would speak about the identity and origin of the prisoner, and then introduce the various evil deeds of the person. Although his tone was very calm when he spoke, but the words between the lines made people tremble with fear. The darkest side of this world, those unimaginable and indescribable evil and terrible horrors, slowly surfaced. The gloomy, dirty and smelly prison seemed to have turned into a terrifying hell. Hundreds of ghosts walked in the night, horrible to look at. There were no images and there were no screams and whimpers, but just imagining the images seemed to be suffocating. Su Qingjuan's hands slowly clenched, and her footsteps became heavier and heavier. Old Ma looked worriedly at the girl's pale face, hesitantly gave a look to Lu Qin. Lu Qin was silent for a moment, walked to Qin Gai's side, gently patted his shoulder, and then whispered a word of thanks. Qin Gai also nodded to Lu Qin, and then walked back and stood together with his other guards. Lu Qin walked to where she was and stood with Su Qingjun, her face pale and breathing rapidly. He looked at the girl's eyes that seemed to suddenly be in a daze and whispered, "Now you know what kind of lunatics we are going to face?" Su Qingjun closed her eyes in pain and after a while softly said, "Why did you bring me here and tell me all these?" Lu Qin said, "I am too lazy to meddle in other people's business, but you may have fought with people before, but you definitely have not really come into contact with these lunatics. I called you over today to let you see this place, is to let you at least be prepared, although the evil sect is weak now, and their strength is not what it used to be, but if there is a fight in the future, you must not have any kind thoughts of leniency. He stared at Su Qingjun, said, I have seen with my own eyes, some good faction cultivators gained the upper hand in the battle with the evil sect, but in the end they were soft-hearted and not ruthless enough, and were suddenly overturned and lost their lives. After a pause, the corner of his mouth seemed to twitch slightly. Among them, there were also some beautiful girls because of this, fell into the hands of the evil sect. Su Qingjun was startled, looked at Lu Chen's ugly face and couldn't help but asked, what happened to them? Lu Chen silently looked at Su Qingjun. For some reason, Su Qingjun at this time suddenly did not dare to look directly at this man's eyes. Her heart started to beat faster, as if she felt something. After a while, Lu Chen indifferently said, believe me, you don't want to know about those things. After speaking, he turned and continued to walk deeper into the prison. Ahead seemed to be reaching the end, which was also the last and most important prison cells. But at this moment, suddenly Su Qingjun grabbed his hand. Her grip was so strong that even Lu Chen felt a trace of pain. Su Qingjun's face right now looked a little scary, so pale that it was frightening, without a trace of blood. Her eyes stared at Lu Chen's eyes as if there was a ball of fire burning. After a moment she opened her mouth, her voice low, word by word said, why are you so clear? Don't tell me you saw it with your own eyes at that time. Once the words were said, the inside and outside of the prison, suddenly a dead silence. Everyone's eyes, including those prison guards, even those sneaky cold eyes in the dark corners of the prison cells, all fell on Lu Chen. That gaze fell on him as sharp and cold as a knife. Just like for so many years, the cruel pain that Lu Chen had to bear. Chapter 473. Lu Chen stood there, enduring the strange stares from the surrounding people, silent and did not speak a word. He looked at Su Qingjun's pale face, her eyes although angry but still clear, like a mirror that had never been tainted by dust. Right and wrong? Right and wrong? Or perhaps only innocence, a pure heart untainted by dust? Was it because someone had once opened his arms in the darkness, used his chest and body to resist the raging tide that filled the sky? But everything that he had done in the past, was it really all right? Those choices, were there any selfishness, were there any fears, was it really worth it? This was not what Lu Chen had imagined. Today he had specially brought Su Qingjun here. It was to let her have a clearer understanding of the evil sect, to let this woman who had a warm memory with him, in the future possible battles and killings, have a higher chance of survival and safety. He did not want to see anything happen to her. Lu Chen opened his mouth, seemed to want to say something, but the next moment, he still maintained his silence. Perhaps even he himself did not know what to say? Su Qingjun's beautiful face, from the initial pale, started to show surprise. She was stunned by Lu Chen's silence and then gradually turned into disappointment. Her emotions were so obvious that everyone could see it. She gently shook her head, looked at Lu Chen and finally softly said, I didn't expect you to be this kind of person. Her voice suddenly rose, her expression agitated and angry. She stared at the silent Lu Chen, like staring at a sinner. Don't tell me you have really seen that kind of thing happen with your own eyes? Right before your eyes, you did not do anything, watched that woman being. She did not continue her words. Perhaps she had never really seen that cruel scene, or perhaps she was too kind-hearted to say those malicious words, but just by imagining, right now it seemed to be enough to make the surrounding people's gazes turn into sharp whips, nailing that silent man on the invisible wooden frame, whipping him countless times. Covered with scars. Covered with cuts and bruises. That wooden frame was called justice. Also called morality. Su Qingjun suddenly turned around and walked away with large strides. She resolutely and angrily left this dark, dirty, and smelly prison. She didn't want to stay in this disgusting place for even a moment. The prison guards behind her subconsciously opened up a path as they watched the woman leave. They looked at each other and frowned slightly. Finally, their gazes landed on Lu Chen. No one spoke, but their gazes didn't seem friendly either. Perhaps in that silence, there was disdain, contempt, hidden anger, and silent condemnation. The situation had suddenly changed in the blink of an eye, catching everyone off guard. Even the usually calm and composed Lu Chen seemed to be at a loss at this moment. Fortunately, at this moment, a figure suddenly walked forward and blocked in front of Lu Chen. Then he laughed like a fool. Ha ha, what's wrong with everyone? We are here to do something today, why do you all look so lifeless, ha ha. Old Ma smiled and turned around. He patted Lu Chen's shoulder and said, let's go, it's just in front. Lu Chen glanced at him, slowly turned around and walked forward with Old Ma. After walking for about 10 steps, they arrived outside the last prison cell. There was a pillar in the prison cell, and on it was a prisoner with disheveled hair tied tightly with iron chains. There were many wounds and bloodstains all over his body. His head was drooping and he looked like he was unconscious. Looking at his face through the messy hair, it was the evil faction sorcerer, Chen He. Old Ma waved to the guards behind him and said, "Open the door, we want to interrogate this person." Accompanied by the clanking of the iron locks, the heavy iron door opened. Lu Qin and Old Ma walked in while the rest of the guards stayed outside. Lu Qin hadn't spoken a single word since the beginning. Even when he walked up to the prisoner, his expression still seemed to be a little dazed. Old Ma looked at him worriedly and looked behind him. Seeing that the prison guards seemed to have a tacit understanding to stand further away, he then heaved a sigh of relief. He walked to Lu Chen's side, lowered his voice and said softly, "I say, are you all right?" Lu Chen slowly shook his head, glanced at the unconscious Chen He and suddenly said, "Today I brought Su Qingjun over. I originally thought that after telling her about the evil faction's vicious methods she would be on her guard. Finally, when we interrogate this person about Elder Ghost's whereabouts, maybe I will use some of the evil faction's cruel methods to make her understand more deeply." Old Ma gave a wry smile and said, "You really put in a lot of effort. Unfortunately this matter seems to be messed up." Lu Chen silently nodded and said, "Yes." Old Ma sighed and said, "Actually a girl like Miss Su, since young she grew up in aristocratic families and famous sects, what she sees, knows and thinks, is different from us. It is really too normal. Let's go." Lu Chen suddenly interrupted his words. Old Ma was taken aback and said, "Not interrogating anymore?" Lu Chen indifferently said, "His injuries are so serious, and those people in Fuyunji's methods, how can they be worse than the evil faction? Till now they have not gotten anything out of him. I reckon I also have no way to pry open his mouth." After speaking he turned and walked out. Old Ma hurriedly followed. Those prison guards standing outside were shocked, came up and asked, "Both sirs, are you not interrogating the prisoner anymore?" Lu Chen silently walked forward and did not answer. Old Ma gave a dry laugh, pointed to the unconscious Chen He in the cell and said, "That prisoner is still unconscious and I have taken a look at his injuries. It is really very serious. He cannot withstand the heavy punishment. It will be very difficult to get anything out of him. 2 days later we will come again in 2 days." The few guards looked at each other, contempt flashed in their eyes, but they did not say anything and very politely sent the two of them out of the prison. Leaving that dark and oppressive prison, even though Old Ma was someone who had seen a lot of the world, he could not help but let out a long sigh of relief, mumbled, "That place is really not suitable for people to stay in." Lu Chen walked beside him, frowning and silent. As they walked, he suddenly glanced at Old Ma. Old Ma's heart jumped for no reason, said, "What? Did I really do something wrong?" Lu Chen asked him in a low voice. Old Ma was speechless. For a moment he did not know what to say. Of course he would not say that Lu Chen was wrong, but just when he wanted to say that he did not do anything wrong and did the right thing, the scene from not long ago suddenly appeared in his mind. Su Qingjuan's sudden questioning was like a whip lashing at him. The imagined cruel scene in his mind made his words suddenly choke in his throat, unable to come out. After a while, Old Ma said bitterly, "Don't let your imagination run wild, it has been so many years. Moreover, back then when you were in the evil cult, if you really wanted to mess around, you would be surrounded by people from the evil cult. Wouldn't that be seeking your own death?" As if he had finally found a reason, Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief, nodded repeatedly and said, "So, even if you make a move to save people, most likely you will not be able to save people, and will instead harm your own life. It is not worth it, right?" Lu Chen's expression still looked very strange. He seemed to be suddenly immersed in the past, somewhat unable to extricate himself. After a while, his face suddenly became a little pale. Old Ma looked at him, couldn't help but be a little worried and asked in a low voice, "Are you all right?" "I forgot the name." Old Ma was startled and said, "What?" Lu Chen slowly raised a palm, staring at his own palm. A trace of pain and confusion finally gradually emerged in the depths of his eyes. Even his voice carried a bit of bitterness. "I forgot that woman's name, Old Ma. I completely forgot her. Am I really like those people from the evil cult, born so cruel and heartless?" Lu Chen murmured, his face as pale as paper. Chapter 474. Behind the main hall of the Heavenly Law Hall was a stretch of green mountains. The trees on the mountain were verdant and the scenery was beautiful. At the peak of the mountain, there were clouds floating around all year round. Looking at it, it was like a fairyland. Even in the vast Sky Dragon Mountain range, it was a unique and good place. Such a spiritual mountain and blessed land was naturally occupied by powerful people. and this Baimu peak was precisely occupied by the heavenly law hall's true monarch Tiehu, who was in a favorable position, and became this deity transformation stage true monarch's dwelling in the true immortal alliance. There were many guards at the bottom of the mountain, but there were very few people at the top of the mountain. This was because Tiehu true monarch had issued a ban. No one could rashly go up the mountain without permission. As for the safety of the mountain, there was a deity transformation stage true monarch living there. What would he be afraid of? On the beautiful peak of Baimu Peak, there was a magnificent cave residence. This was Tiehu true monarch's temporary imperial residence. And in the entire heavenly law hall, besides Tiehu true monarch, there was only one person who could freely enter and exit this place. That was Tiehu true monarch's adopted daughter, Song Wenji. Ever since this woman appeared at Tiehu true monarch's side, it seemed that she had always been taking care of this illustrious deity transformation stage true monarch's daily life. Therefore, this could probably be considered as Song Wenji's home. This charming and beautiful woman was lying on the bed, her bright eyes looking at the smooth stone surface of the ceiling. The stone surface was like a mirror, and there was an indistinct reflection of an old body lying on top of her white, soft, plump and beautiful body. The old body was constantly wriggling, and the sound of panting echoed in this quiet stone room, mixed with some strange moans. Her beautiful hair was disheveled, her cheeks were somewhat flushed, and moans were coming from her mouth. Each moan was soft and captivating, but also caused one's blood to boil. It was as if she was deeply immersed in that bewitching passion and was unable to extricate herself. But only her pair of eyes were still quiet, bright and cold. She looked coldly at herself in the reflection and at the woman who was moaning in the flesh. Deep in her eyes, a trace of inexplicable pain and disgust flashed past. Suddenly the old man's breathing increased by a few notches. Song Wenji's gaze suddenly changed from clear and bright to blurry and crazy. She suddenly stretched out her bare white arms and hugged the man's neck tightly. Then, the moans in her mouth also became louder, as if she had become incomparably happy at that moment. However, at the corner of her mouth, there was a faint mocking smile. Finally, with a few soft cries, the old man seemed to have lost all his strength. He suddenly relaxed and fell on Song Wenji's plump body. At this moment, all of Song Wenji's strange emotions disappeared. She suddenly became a well-behaved woman. She shyly and resentfully hugged the man. Using a soul-stealing voice, she complained with a bit of breath, "Godfather, are you trying to torture your daughter to death?" That white-haired man was Tiehu Supreme. At this moment, he did not have his usual solemn and dignified expression. Instead, there was a bit of lust. If this scene was seen by outsiders, the jaws of everyone in the world would drop. And after hearing the words of this coquettish goddaughter, Tiehu Supreme seemed to be even happier. He laughed out loud and even wriggled his body a few times. With a bit of obscenity in his mouth, he teased, "Ha, my good daughter, are you convinced, are you convinced?" Song Wenji exclaimed and then hugged Tiehu Supreme's body. With a slightly trembling voice, as if crying and laughing at the same time, she said, "I am convinced, your daughter is convinced." At this moment, Tiehu Supreme seemed to have finally obtained great satisfaction. His body lay to the side and started to breathe heavily. Then he reached out and hugged Song Wenji's soft white body. He sighed and said, "My good daughter, if not for you, I feel that I have lived my life in vain." Song Wenji nestled in the arms of this deity stage supreme. Hearing this, she laughed and said, "Father, you are joking again. You are a deity stage supreme. You have lived your life in a high position. You have experienced many storms and seen many wonderful things. How could you have lived your life in vain? You only know how to coax me." Tiehu Supreme snorted and looked at the smooth mirror-like stone surface above his head. He said, "You don't understand. For so many years, I have been burdened by those false reputations. In front of everyone in the world, I am justice, I am a moral article. In everyone's eyes, I am born to be solemn and just, clean and self-respecting. There can be no mistakes. I used to think so too. That's why I lived like that for most of my life until I met you." He suddenly spat and said with disgust and hatred, "I've finally seen through everything. All the people in this world are strict with themselves and strict with others. It's funny that I've been stupid for half my life. It's only now that I understand the principle of enjoying life in the present." Song Wenji was touched. She said softly, "Father, you have suffered. But it's okay. You have such a high level of cultivation. You must have a long life ahead of you. Let me accompany you in the future." Tiehu Supreme nodded his head and laughed, of course, as long as you are with me." Song Wenji suddenly said coquettishly, "But my cultivation is not as high as yours. I will grow old in the future. Perhaps at that time you will not like me anymore. Lord Steelpot quickly shook his head and said, No, no, as long as I am here, you can use all the rare treasures and cultivation resources in the world. In addition to that, I will personally protect you. I guarantee that your cultivation will improve tremendously and no one will be able to catch up to you. Your appearance will also remain youthful forever. But if that's the case after a long time, maybe you'll get tired of looking at me and probably don't want me anymore. At the end of her sentence, Song Wenji's eyes actually turned red. She looked like she was moved and hurt and she was actually about to cry. The Iron Pot Lord was a hero of his generation. He had an earth-shattering cultivation and supernatural powers, but at this moment he was helpless and looked extremely embarrassed. The girl in front of him was really his precious treasure. He was afraid that she would fall. He loved her dearly and spoiled her endlessly. Immediately his forehead was full of sweat. He coaxed her continuously. He even pointed to the heavens and swore to the earth. He said all kinds of mushy words and promises non-stop. With great difficulty he managed to coax this goddaughter until her tears turned into a smile. Tiehu Supreme heaved a sigh of relief. They talked and laughed for a while. Then they stood up. Song Wenji helped him put on his clothes. Then she changed back to the dignified Tiehu Supreme. Song Wenji went to the side and poured a cup of tea for him. Iron Pot True Lord took a sip and suddenly looked into the teacup and said, This is the famous tea of Kunlun Mountain, Little Crane? Song Wenji smiled and said, Yes. A few days ago, Lord Tianlan held a disciple ceremony. You went to congratulate him and gave him a gift. There was a little of this tea in the return gift, but it was not much. Tiehu Supreme nodded and said, This tea is indeed rare. It is rare to have a little of it. Then he looked at Song Wenji dotingly and said, If you like this tea, you can drink it first. I'll go to Tianlan later and ask him to bring some more. Song Wenji was stunned. There seemed to be a glimmer in the depths of her eyes. Then she said with a little doubt, Don't go. Don't you have a normal relationship with that person? True Monarch Tai who said disapprovingly, It's just so, but who can really tear his face apart? Look at his disciple acceptance ceremony, didn't I also go there? I have to give face. Moreover, if I ask him for some tea he will give me face. Song Wenji suddenly smiled as if she was very happy. She said, Thank you, foster father. You are so good to me. Tiehu Supreme looked a little proud. But after a while he seemed to think of something. His face showed a thoughtful expression. Then he said slowly, Speaking of this, I feel that there is something strange in Tianlan and Fiyunji recently. Song Wenji was surprised and said, What's wrong? Tiehu Supreme frowned and said, He transferred a lot of people from the Kunlun party. He said that he wants to fight against the devil cult. Of course, he has been fighting against the devil cult for so many years. It is not the first time that he transferred people from the Kunlun party. It is not strange that he did not. After thinking for a long time he still shook his head. Song Wenji looked at his expression and suddenly said, Foster father, do you suspect that there is something wrong with Fiyunji? Tiehu Supreme pondered for a moment and suddenly said, Have you met Lu Chen, the new disciple of Tianlan? Yes. Well then do me a favor. Huh? Then, Supreme Tiehu's voice deepened as if he was narrating something. Chapter 475. After the sky darkened, the bustling immortal city started to quiet down. Although there were many bustling places that were still brightly lit, and the laughter of welcome and farewell echoed in the night, most places still entered the silence of the night. In the alley behind the horse-washing bridge, a white-clothed girl walked over alone, and stopped in front of that house. Her figure seemed a little lonely, and her face faintly looked a little haggard. But from her expression she had already recovered her initial calmness and beauty, and once again became a fairy that didn't eat the food of the mortal world. She was White Lotus. She stood at the door for a while, and using some unknown method she gently opened the door and then walked in. Far behind her, on the horse-washing bridge outside the alley, two black figures slowly appeared. Seeing White Lotus walk into the house, they looked at each other and seemed to have a feeling of relief. Finally returned. Following this little grandaunt for a few days and nights, I'm almost exhausted to death. Come on, at least she's safe and sound. Last night you saw her walk to the edge of the immortal city. If she took another step forward, she would have crossed the boundary. My heart was hanging in my throat. The person in front said in a low voice, What did you say? The person at the side was startled and then smiled bitterly, Don't let your imagination run wild. That little girl is so beautiful, how many have you seen? I really don't want to kill her, but if I really did, I still feel that it would be a pity. The person in front was silent. He probably felt the same way. After a while, he said unhappily, forget it. In any case, the orders from above are not to leave the city. Once you cross the border, you are not to be left alive. I don't know if that girl feels that way, but in any case, it's fine if she returns now. Big brother, who do you think gave the order to kill her? It's really ruthless? Ruthless what? You talk too much. The person in front was startled and covered the mouth of the person next to him. Then he looked around vigilantly. After confirming that there was no movement around, he let go of his hand and shouted in a low voice, "Are you crazy? White Lotus is with a mortal. How dare you talk nonsense about this?" That person's neck shrank in fear. He seemed to have suddenly thought of something and looked at the house with some fear. The person in front also looked over. After a while he seemed to be a little emotional. He sighed and said, "Let's go. That girl's fate is not good, but it's not our fault. Someone will be coming over to take over later. Go and rest." The two shadows once again disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the silent night surrounding the houses. On the grass in the courtyard, the black dog was lying on the ground with a pair of dog eyes closed. It seemed that he had fallen asleep. Lucien was lying next to Atsu. His eyes were staring at the faint twinkling stars in the dark night sky, his body lying motionless. At this time, a voice came from the side. "I say, what's so good about those stars in the sky? Why did you look at them for so long?" Lucien turned around and looked at old Ma, who was holding a wine pot and drinking by himself. He shook his head and said nothing. Old Ma was a little helpless. He said, "I say, you don't have to be like this, right? I've known you for many years. Don't talk about that stupid thing where you leave people to die. How many lives have you killed and how much blood have you seen? Your heart will only be harder than mine, not softer than mine. Why are you suddenly so inexplicably unable to think things through today?" He suddenly seemed to think of something. A strange expression flashed across his face. He looked down at Lucien and said, "Don't tell me, you really have some feelings for Su Qingjun? That's why you care so much about what she says?" Lucien frowned. When he was about to speak, he suddenly heard light footsteps coming from the corridor ahead. Lucien and old Ma were both taken aback. They turned their heads to look at the source of the voice. A while later they saw the white-robed Bai Lian walk out from the shadows of the corridor. She walked all the way to the courtyard and stood in front of them. Lucien and old Ma both stood up. Old Ma spoke first with a smile. "White Lotus, you're back?" White Lotus responded and nodded to him. Then she looked at Lucien. Lucien gave a hollow laugh. He felt a little uncomfortable. But after hesitating for a moment he still said, "White Lotus, I really didn't mean to do this to you, I know." White Lotus interrupted Lucien. She looked calm and said, "I've thought about it. It's my fault. I used to think that I was destined to have a smooth life because I have the talent of 5 pillars. Everyone would value me. Even after my master passed away, the other elders in the sect would do the same. But now I know that it doesn't include martial uncle Tianlan. I was too optimistic." Lucien and old Ma looked at each other and didn't know what to say for a moment. White Lotus was silent for a moment and said, "I'm a little tired. I'll go to bed first." As she said this, she turned around and walked to her room. Unexpectedly, she was suddenly stopped by old Ma. White Lotus looked over with some surprise, only to see old Ma smile awkwardly. He turned around and ran into the house first, then tossed and turned inside for a while. Finally he ran out with a large pile of bedding and clothes. He smiled dryly at White Lotus and then ran into Lucien's house. White Lotus was silent for a while and turned to look at Lucien. Lucien had an awkward expression on his face. He coughed dryly and smiled a little unnaturally. Old Ma lives at my place and he's been getting bullied by Atu all day long. He can only sleep on the floor. Plus, you had such a big reaction that day and we couldn't find you for a few days, so he thought you wouldn't come back." White Lotus snorted and glared at him. Then she strode past Lucien. Lucien quickly stepped aside as if he had done something wrong. When White Lotus was about to reach the door of the room, she suddenly turned around and called, "Hey!" Lucien said, "What's wrong?" White Lotus stared at him and said after a while, "Do you think I'm still useful to martial uncle Tianlan?" Lucien's heart suddenly tightened. Then he smiled and said, "You're so powerful. Of course you're useful." White Lotus nodded. It seemed that the fierceness and uneasiness hidden deep in her eyes softened a little. Then she turned around and went into the room. Lu Chen looked over there for a long time until old Ma walked back to him. Lu Chen looked back at him and saw that old Ma's face was a little strange. He couldn't help frowning and asking, "What's wrong?" Old Ma sighed softly and lowered his voice, saying, "You should know in your heart that she's useless." Lu Chen was silent. Seeing that his face was a little ugly, old Ma shook his head and changed the topic, saying, "Forget it. Let's not talk about this. Anyway, it doesn't matter what we say. You haven't answered me yet. What were you thinking about when you were in a daze for so long?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and suddenly said something without rhyme or reason. "Her name is Song Hui." Old Ma was stunned and asked, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen said slowly, "I've thought about it for a long time and carefully recalled it bit by bit. Finally, I remembered the name of the dead woman. Her name is Song Hui." He turned to old Ma and said with a serious look on his face, "Do me a favor, old Ma. Go and check this woman's background." Chapter 476. When the sun rose in the early morning, the soft sunlight shone through the gap of the window and turned into a beam of pale golden light falling on the bed. White Lotus was wrapped in the quilt, curled up into a ball and slept. Her slender eyelashes flickered occasionally, and her face was slightly pale. She looked like a frightened kitten, slightly trembling in her dream. When the ray of sunlight finally moved to her eyes, perhaps it was because of the dazzling light, or perhaps it was because of the warmth, Bai Lian's body suddenly trembled. She cried out in surprise and sat up abruptly. She opened her eyes wide and looked forward. What came into view was the familiar furniture of the house, the white walls, the tables and chairs. White Lotus stared blankly for a while, and her originally rapid breathing gradually calmed down, as if she had broken free from that nightmare. She reached out her hand and gently touched her forehead. Then she lifted the quilt and got out of bed. She walked to the table and poured a glass of water. She didn't care that it was the cold water from last night and drank it in big gulps. There was a faint movement in the yard outside the house. White Lotus glanced outside. After hesitating for a moment, she tidied up her clothes, walked to the door, opened the door and walked out. The warm sunlight suddenly sprinkled on her slim body. The dazzling golden light made her slightly squint. After a while she saw that in the yard, Lu Chen and old Ma were standing there talking, but Atsu was nowhere to be seen. He was probably still sleeping in the house. Seeing White Lotus come out, Lu Chen and old Ma stopped talking and smiled at her. Then Lu Chen said to old Ma. Old Ma nodded and turned to leave. But he seemed to think of something and turned to Lu Chen and said, "I can help you investigate, but those things in the past, how can I take care of them one by one? Let's forget about it." Lu Chen nodded slightly and his face was also calm. He said, "I understand. It's okay. Don't worry." Old Ma smiled and turned to walk out. White Lotus walked over slowly. After watching old Ma's figure disappear from her sight, she said to Lu Chen, "What does he want to help you investigate? Why does it sound so weird?" "It's just an old matter of adulthood. It's nothing important." Lu Chen waved his hand and said nonchalantly. At the same time he looked her up and down and smiled. "Did you sleep well last night?" White Lotus said, "Very good. I fell asleep as soon as I went to bed and slept until dawn. If you don't sleep for several days and nights, you'll probably end up like this too." Lu Chen's eyes flickered as he looked at White Lotus. "What's wrong? Is there something on your mind?" White Lotus nodded, but she did not say what was on her mind. Instead, she stared at Lu Chen and said, "Can I follow you to do something today?" Lu Chen was stunned. Just as he was about to say something, he heard White Lotus say again, "The order for me to follow you was also given by your Shizuan, my uncle master, perfected Lord Tianlan. This shouldn't be a problem, right?" Lu Chen was silent. Then he sighed and said, "All right." Fuyunji had captured a total of 12 surviving members of the devil cult during the battle in the underground palace of the Immortal City. Now, all of them were imprisoned in the prison specially prepared for the captives of the devil cult. As the new disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan, Lu Chen's public mission was to deal with the sinister and vicious devil cult. Therefore, on this day he brought White Lotus to this prison again. The first time he came here, it was old Ma and Su Qingjun who followed him. This time it was all changed. She became a white-clothed girl who looked exceptionally beautiful and had the temperament of a fairy. However, from the strange looks of the prison guards, it could be seen that White Lotus's temperament did not seem to be too harmonious with this place. This dirty, dark and stinky place where evil was imprisoned seemed to be of a completely different world from the most beautiful fairy in people's imagination. However, White Lotus did not seem to care about this. She calmly followed Lu Chen into this dark place. At Lu Chen's request, the guards brought them to the room that was used to interrogate prisoners, which was the so-called interrogation room. As for the prisoners, of course, they were the surviving members of the devil cult who had been captured recently. However, after careful questioning, the leader, Qin He, was seriously injured and unconscious and could not be interrogated for the time being. There were also 6 or 7 people, so in the end only 5 people could be brought over. While the others were waiting outside, Lu Chen and White Lotus were also sitting in this interrogation room. Then, they looked at the various torture instruments stained with dark red blood around them and looked at each other speechlessly. A faint smell of blood seemed to permeate this place, causing people to feel nauseous. It also caused people to feel a chill down their spines. Lu Chen was silent for a moment and whispered to White Lotus, "This place is not suitable for you. Why don't you go back first?" White Lotus slowly shook her head and said, "I will help you here." Lu Chen frowned and said, "What will you help me with?" White Lotus looked at him and said softly, "I can help you with anything you want to do." Lu Chen frowned even more and said, "What are you thinking?" White Lotus took a step forward and looked at Lu Chen and said, "No matter what you want me to do, I can help you. But can you please tell Martial Uncle Tianlan that I still have some use for you when you see him later?" Lu Chen suddenly became silent. After a long while, he smiled bitterly and said, "There is no need to do that, I don't want to die." White Lotus suddenly interrupted him. She stared at Lu Chen's eyes and suddenly grabbed Lu Chen's hand. She held it tightly and said word by word, "Do you dare to tell me that Martial Uncle will definitely not kill me?" Lu Chen was speechless. White Lotus's body trembled slightly and then she slowly lowered her head and said, "He publicly accepted you as his disciple. It means that he is no longer afraid and doesn't have to worry about anything. I am probably useless to him, right?" She gritted her teeth and suddenly her eyes became a little red. She whispered, "I am only 14 years old. I don't want to die." Lu Chen forced a smile and pulled his hand out of her soft palm and said, "There is no evidence. Maybe you are thinking too much. By the way, look at your second senior brother. He is fine. I am a Wuzhu talent." White Lotus's face was pale and she said in a trembling voice, "Wuzhu, if I can't be his disciple, then in the future he will think about the dead senior brother every day and leave behind a rare Wuzhu talent disciple. If it were you, what would you do?" Lu Chen's mouth squirmed, but in the end he didn't say anything. Some truths, in fact, everyone understood it in their heart. They just pretended not to understand until others tore off the disguise and put the cruel and bloody facts in front of them. Dong dong dong. There was a knock on the door. White Lotus wiped her eyes and walked over to open the door. At the same time she murmured, "Let me help you. In this world, besides you, who else will he listen to?" Lu Chen stood in the same place, silent. When old Ma arrived outside the prison, it was the time of the day when the sun was at its brightest. However, standing at the entrance of the prison, the chilly wind that blew out from inside still made people shiver in their hearts. It was a bit bone-chilling. However, he didn't enter the prison because Lu Chen and White Lotus also came out at this time. When old Ma was about to speak, he found that both of their faces didn't look good. Old Ma looked at them suspiciously, then he pulled Lu Chen aside and whispered, "Are you okay?" Lu Chen hesitated for a moment and looked at White Lotus, then he sighed and said, "I'm fine." Old Ma followed his gaze and was suddenly startled. He saw White Lotus standing alone under a tree over there. She looked as cold as usual, but for some reason, it always made people feel a little strange. After a moment, Old Ma suddenly frowned and his eyes swept over White Lotus. He saw that the hem of her white dress was stained with blood in several places. Even her soft and white palms were dyed dark red. It was a ghastly sight. Old Ma's heart suddenly jumped and he subconsciously swallowed his saliva. Looking at the silent figure of the girl, he casually asked, "Did you find out anything?" Lu Chen said, "Yes." In the distance, under the sunlight of the tree, White Lotus raised his head and looked at the scattered rays of sunlight sprinkling down from the dense branches and leaves. He narrowed his eyes slightly, and then seemed to feel a chill in his body and his body trembled. Chapter 477. At the entrance of the prison far away, a few Fuyunji prison guards were watching from afar. Although there was a distance between them, one could still see the strange and complicated expressions on their faces. And most of their gazes were on White Lotus, who was quietly standing under the big tree. White Lotus seemed to be unaware of the gazes from the outside. She squinted her eyes and looked up for a while. Then she pulled out a silk handkerchief and started to wipe her hands. The red blood stains dyed the white silk red, making the handkerchief dirty. But the blood stains on her palms only lightened in color. She was unable to wipe them clean. White Lotus wiped them hard, bit by bit, as if she was very patient. Old Ma frowned, retracted his gaze and said to Lu Qin in a low voice, "What did you get from her?" Lu Qin said, "There are 3 secret nests of the evil faction in Immortal City that we didn't know about before. And there are more than 20 spies lurking in Immortal City." Old Ma said, "The previous incident was so big, these evil faction remnants that we didn't catch most likely all ran away?" Lu Qin nodded. He had obviously thought of this as well. "That's true. We've been delayed here for a few days, so I'm guessing that a lot of them have escaped. However, some of them are single-person contacts and they're well-hidden spies. If we don't contact them, they might not make a move." Old Ma nodded and said, "This is a good harvest. Usually it's hard to get information out of them." As he spoke, he turned his head to look under the big tree. After a moment of hesitation, he asked Lu Qin in a low voice, "How did she ask? Is her method very powerful?" On the word, powerful, Old Ma intentionally or unintentionally emphasized it. Lu Qin also understood what he meant. He said in a deep voice, "Very powerful." Old Ma sucked in a breath of cold air. He looked surprised and said, "She is such a delicate little girl and grew up in an aristocratic family. How could she know this kind of method?" "Who knows?" Lu Qin shook his head and muttered. At the same time, the scene of him and Atsu meeting White Lotus for the first time on Kunlun Mountain suddenly appeared in his mind. At that time in the deep forest, the wild beasts were covered in wounds and blood. It was a terrible sight to behold. Even now, when he recalled that scene, Lu Qin seemed to be able to smell a strong stench of blood. Old Ma saw that Lu Qin's expression was a little ugly, so he asked, "What's wrong?" Lu Qin was silent for a moment, then he shook his head and said nonchalantly, "I'm fine." Old Ma did not pursue the matter. He changed the topic and asked, "These are all trivial matters. What about Elder Gui? Did you find out the whereabouts of that person?" "No." Lu Qin said, "I did ask, but even in the evil faction, that old tortoise only contacted Qin He. All the other evil faction evil people have never seen this person." Old Ma was taken aback. His face turned a little ugly and said, "This guy is very careful. These few years, the evil cult had been on the decline and they were also being chased by the True Immortal Alliance and the Fuyun Agency, these huge organizations. Therefore, it was not surprising that the only remaining elder ghost was exceptionally careful. However, as the highest-ranking elder in the entire evil cult, he was actually so cowardly that he only contacted one person. This still made one somewhat speechless. Then we can only interrogate Qin He?" Old Ma asked. Lu Qin nodded and said, "Let's wait for him to wake up first." As he said this, he glanced at Old Ma and slightly raised his eyebrows. He said, "Didn't you say you were going to investigate that matter this morning? Did you find anything?" After hearing his words, Old Ma suddenly had a strange expression on his face. He first looked left and right, then pulled Lu Qin 2 steps to the side and whispered, "That woman's name, did you remember wrongly?" "Remember wrongly?" Lu Qin looked at him in astonishment. Then he frowned and thought carefully for a while. Finally, he firmly said to Old Ma, "Yes, it is the name Song Hui." Old Ma sighed and said, "There is no woman with this name in Zhang Xianmeng's name list." "No." Lu Qin's expression changed. Old Ma nodded and replied with certainty, "I've looked through all the people with the surname Song, and there is no such name." Lu Qin fell silent for a while. It should be known that Zhang Xianmeng could almost be regarded as the most prosperous and powerful cultivator organization in history. In addition to the many extremely powerful cultivators, it relied on all kinds of comprehensive rules. All the cultivators who had joined Zhang Xianmeng would definitely be recorded in the name list. Therefore, if there was no Song Hui on the name list, there were only 2 possibilities. One was that Lu Qin remembered the woman's name wrongly. The other was that he remembered the woman's identity wrongly. Perhaps she was not from Zhang Xianmeng. This was also the situation Old Ma was thinking about. But after frowning and thinking for a long time, Lu Qin finally said to Old Ma with certainty, "If I remember correctly, that woman is indeed from Zhang Xianmeng." Old Ma spread out his hands helplessly. Lu Qin was silent for a moment and suddenly said to him, "There is another secret name list in Zhang Xianmeng." Old Ma was shocked and whispered, "Didn't you say she was not a shadow of Fuyunji?" Lu Qin nodded and slightly frowned, "I remember she is not. But just in case, can you help me to check again?" Old Ma showed an awkward expression and said, "That is a name list specially for you shadows. In the whole Sky Dragon Mountain, only Lord Immortal and Hall Master Shuaying can read it. If I go there rashly. Lu Chen looked at him and then slowly said, "Forget it, I will ask Shuaying for it." After saying that, he turned around and left. But before he left, he looked back at White Lotus but saw that White Lotus did not look at them from beginning to end. She just stood there quietly and wiped her hands with a silk handkerchief. And now the square silk handkerchief had completely turned red. Lu Chen came to the main hall of Fuyunji and asked someone to inform him that he wanted to see Shuaying. But very soon, someone very politely came to tell him that Hall Master Shuaying had gone down Sky Dragon Mountain early in the morning and had not returned yet. Lu Chen asked where Shuaying went, but the people of Fuyunji just shook their heads that they did not know. It was said that the whereabouts of that person had always been mysterious. No one knew. Of course, no one dared to ask where she went. Lu Chen felt a little helpless, but he could only turn back. But when he passed by the courtyard of the Kunlun party's experts, he stopped. After a slight hesitation, he walked in that direction. One of the houses in the row was where Su Qingjun was living. No matter what, Lu Chen still wanted to talk to this woman and at least explain what had happened that day. But just as he walked to the door of Su Qingjun's residence, he suddenly saw a slender figure walking towards him. She was charming and beautiful, and her eyes were like water. It was Song Wenji, whom he had not seen for a long time. At the same time, Song Wenji also saw Lu Chen. A smile immediately appeared on her face. Like a lotus leaf blown by the wind, she walked over with snake-like steps and stood in front of Lu Chen. She smiled and said, "Where are you going, junior brother Lu? You call me junior brother?" Lu Chen was a little surprised. Song Wenji laughed and said, "Isn't that normal? Your master, True Lord Tianlan, and my foster father, True Lord Tiehu, have been best friends for many years. I became his foster daughter much earlier than you, so it's not too much for me to call you junior brother, right?" Lu Chen smiled bitterly. He cupped his hands in front of his chest and said, "Whatever." Song Wenji's charming eyes moved. Suddenly she smiled sweetly and said, "It's rare to meet you. My house is not far in front. Why don't you come to my house and have a cup of tea?" Lu Chen shook his head and was about to refuse. He said, "I'm sorry, Song Wenji covered her mouth and interrupted his words. She seemed to be in high spirits and in a good mood. She smiled and said, "I'll let you witness my tea ceremony skills. Oh yes, my tea is also good. Speaking of which, we are fated. It's your Kunlun Mountain's famous tea, Little Crane." Little Crane. Lu Chen's expression suddenly changed. After a while, he let out a long breath and said, "Then I'll have to trouble you." Song Wenji giggled like a coquettish spring flower blooming. For a moment, her beauty was unparalleled. It was as if her whole person had brightened up. She pointed her fair finger forward and said, "It's just in front. Follow me." Chapter 478. Just as Lu Chen and Song Wenji were about to leave, they suddenly heard a squeaking sound coming from the door not far away, and then it was pushed open. Then Su Qingjun came out. There were 2 stone steps at the door. Su Qingjun was standing on the stone steps and was about to go down when she saw the figures of Lu Chen and Song Wenji standing together. There was a hint of surprise on her face. Her eyes lingered on Song Wenji's charming face and enchanting figure for a moment, and then fell on Lu Chen. Lu Chen didn't know why, but he suddenly felt a little embarrassed. He wanted to say something to Su Qingjun, but he didn't know what to say for a moment. He just smiled at her and nodded. Song Wenji, who was next to him, was also a smart and astute woman. At a glance, she could tell that the situation between the man and the woman seemed to be a little different. Her eyes flickered for a moment, then she smiled at Lu Chen and said, "Senior brother Lu, who is this?" Her words were spoken in an unusually gentle manner. Coupled with her watery eyes and gentle smile, she was truly charming but not obscene. She was a beautiful woman who could make anyone's eyes light up and feel tender affection for her. Lu Chen saw that Su Qingjuan's face quickly became cold, and was speechless for a moment. After shaking his head slightly, he said, "Let me introduce you, this is Su Qingjun of the Kunlun Party. Qingjun, this is junior sister Song Wenji of the Heavenly Law Hall of Zhengxianmeng. She is the adopted daughter of the Iron Pot Immortal. A while ago she helped us track down the evil people in the Immortal City." He purposely emphasized the word, help. It was obvious that Song Wenji's previous help was actually a hindrance. However, Song Wenji didn't seem to hear this at all. She smiled at Su Qingjun and said, "Shiji Su, this is the first time we meet. I don't know if you have time now. Why don't you go have tea with us?" Su Qingjun frowned and glanced at Lu Qin. Song Wenji laughed and said, "That's right. It wasn't easy for me to invite Senior Marshal Brother Lu to my place to drink tea. Moreover, the tea leaves are the famous little crane, tea produced by your Kunlun sect. Senior Marshal Sister Su, you should come too." Su Qingjuan's face was indifferent. After looking at Lu Qin, she said with a trace of alienation, "Thank you, Miss Song, but I have something to do now. I will disturb you again when I have the chance in the future." With that she turned to leave. But at this time the two women suddenly heard a cough from Lu Qin, and then they heard Lu Qingjun say Lu Qin, Song Qin to say I Lu Qin to say I you I to say I Qin Lu to Qing to say. There. I suddenly I Su to say I see Qing Su's Chen's to say to. And let's wait for next time. I'm sorry. Song Wenji's smile froze for a moment, then she looked at Lu Qin with a smile that was not a smile and said, "Senior Brother Lu, you are really a busy man." Lu Qin laughed dryly and walked towards Su Qingjun while waving his hand at her. After that, he smiled apologetically and said, "I'm really sorry, I really do have something to do. I'll treat you to a good meal in Immortal City next time." Song Wenji looked at the two people walking away one after another. The surprise on her face did not disappear. Thinking about it, ever since she grew up, especially after she became the adopted daughter of Taihu deity, it had been a long time since someone dared to stand her up, and the excuse was not at all reliable. She glanced at Lu Chen's back and after a while she suddenly smiled. She didn't seem to be too angry and only nodded thoughtfully. Then her eyes fell on Su Qingjuan's back, and her eyes gradually brightened. "Why are you following me?" After walking for a distance and seeing that there was no one around, and only Lu Chen was walking beside her, Su Qingjun stopped and said to him with a slight frown. Lu Chen also stopped and after a moment of silence said, "Qingjun, I have something to say to you." Su Qingjuan's face was a little gloomy and cold, but it was hard to tell whether she was happy or sad. She only said indifferently, "What are you talking to me about instead of drinking tea and chatting with Beauty Song? Besides, didn't you just say that you have an important prisoner to interrogate in Fuyunji prison?" Lu Chen said, "I was just brushing her off." Su Qingjun suddenly clenched her teeth, looking a little angry, and said coldly, "So you lied to her? You always like to lie to people and do everything you do. Lies come out of your mouth. That's why you were able to deceive me on Kunlun Mountain, and make me trust you so much?" Lu Chen opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something but soon stopped. After a long while he said with a bitter smile, "If you want to say it like that, it doesn't seem wrong. More than 10 years ago I was a shadow lying in ambush in the evil sect, and I lived this kind of life of lying to people all day long." Saying this, he shook his head, and his expression suddenly seemed a little bleak. He sighed, "That kind of life is not easy." As a young boy, he had mingled with a group of vicious demons since he was young. He lived a precarious life, and no one knew when he would suddenly lose his life. How could such a life be easy? Just thinking about it made one's scalp tingle. Su Qingjun wasn't a stupid woman. She was very smart, so she quickly thought of Lu Chen's situation back then. This slightly moved her expression, and there was even a trace of pity in the depths of her eyes when she looked at Lu Chen. However, in the end she was not a weak woman. After taking a deep breath, she shook her head and said in a low voice, "I know it has not been easy for you, but today the bitterness has finally come to an end." With that, she turned around and was about to walk forward again. Lu Chen took a step forward to stop her. Su Qingjun frowned. "Is there anything else?" Lu Chen gazed at her clear and bright eyes. "Qingjun, it doesn't matter what you think of me, including that day in the prison. You feel that I was wrong for not saving that woman called Song Hui. That's up to you. But I only hope that you still remember, there are many lunatics among those evil sect evil people. In the future when you meet with these people, you must be careful, you must not be soft-hearted, otherwise in the end you will hurt yourself." Su Qingjun took a deep breath and looked at Lu Chen. "Thank you for your reminder. I will remember it. But I don't understand. Don't you feel the slightest bit of remorse for that woman?" Lu Chen fell silent. After a while he said softly, "To tell you the truth, I don't regret it." Su Qingjun glared at him angrily. Lu Chen heaved a sigh of relief and said, "At that time I was surrounded by demons of the devil cult. I couldn't save her. Even if I tried, I would have perished together with them. Moreover, I had another mission." "Really? Were you afraid?" Su Qingjun said coldly, "At that time were you afraid of death?" Lu Chen raised his head to look at Su Qingjun. He frowned slightly and his expression sank. After a while he said calmly, I don't think I'm afraid of death. If I was afraid of death, perhaps I wouldn't have stayed in the evil sect for so long and done so many things. Qingjun, you grew up in a peaceful family. You won't understand the situation of a shadow like me. If you were in that situation and saw me being captured and abused, then you would also. I will take action. Su Qingjun suddenly interrupted Lu Chen and said calmly. What? Lu Chen was stunned. I will save you even if I have to die with you. Su Qingjun gazed deeply at him and walked forward without looking back. Chapter 479. A person's life is so long. There are bound to be crossroads. Sometimes you can choose and sometimes you don't even have the chance to choose. When the moon was in the middle of the sky, the gentle moonlight shone on the quiet yard. Lu Chen and Old Ma sat opposite each other. Atsu was lying at Lu Chen's feet, and White Lotus was nowhere to be seen. She should have gone back to her room to sleep. After listening to Lu Chen's words, Old Ma didn't seem to care and said, I don't think so. When will we really have the chance to choose? Lu Chen picked up the wine pot and poured himself a glass of wine. He said, You see, I have 2 places to sleep. One is the magnificent and spacious Kunlun temple on the mountain, and the other is this obscure place with you, an eyesore. But I chose to live here. This is the choice we can make. Okay. Old Ma waved his hand and looked speechless. After a while, he suddenly asked, Don't you plan to talk to Su Qingjun? Lu Chen's hand that was holding the wine cup paused for a moment. Then he raised his head and drank it. He shook his head and said, No. Old Ma asked, Why? Everyone has different ideas. They can't be together. The corner of Lu Chen's mouth twitched. There seemed to be a bitter smile. Then he sighed and said, Like we said before, we have come to a crossroad. I chose this path but she chose the other one. What else can we do? In addition, I killed her brother on the mountain in Kunlun a few years ago. If she is with me, she will not be accepted by her parents and the whole Su family. So let's forget it. Old Ma nodded. He didn't look too surprised. It seemed that he had expected this result. He said, This is also good. You two are not very suitable for each other. If you separate, everyone will be more relaxed. Lu Chen lowered his eyes slightly and slowly poured himself a cup of wine. After a while, he said in a low voice, Yeah, it's good to treat her this way. Anyway, all the women who were close to me are dead now. It was late at night, and the moonlight seemed to become a little cold. Old Ma yawned and stood up to go back to his room to sleep. Turning his head, he saw that Lu Chen was still sitting there in a daze. Old Ma patted him on the shoulder and said, What are you thinking? Go back to sleep. Lu Chen said, Nothing. I just thought that Su Qingjun said today that she would rather die together than to save me. I just felt a little emotional. Old Ma said, He hesitated for a moment and asked, Do you think that Su Qingjun said those words out of anger or will she really do what she said? Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, According to my understanding of her, if she said she will save, she will most likely do it. Old Ma said, Even if she was surrounded by evil sect demons at that time, even if there was no hope of saving people and she would almost certainly lose her life? Even so, she will still save people? Lu Chen nodded and said, Should be. I guess in her heart, she must be thinking that she can't bear to see the people important to her being abused and suffering. So she will do anything to help. Even if she is in a desperate situation, she will first relieve the pain of others. In the end, she will also lose her life by committing suicide. It's not worth it. Old Ma frowned and said, It is the first time I have heard of someone like her. Lu Chen looked at him and did not speak. Old Ma said, What's wrong? Could it be that after what Su Qingjun said to you, you also have some regrets about what happened that year? Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, I have already told her during the day, even if I have to do it again, my choice will still not change. I will still hide in the evil sect without saying a word until the end. Old Ma smiled and was about to speak when he suddenly heard Lu Chen said, But now I don't think that Su Qingjun is definitely wrong. Sometimes I will think, could it be that we have been shadows for too long? What we see, hear and think are all the same? Everyone said to be calm, to be patient, to look at the overall situation, to do whatever it takes for the final success. Even if we have to sacrifice ourselves, it doesn't matter. Doesn't it matter if the person sacrificed is ourselves or others? Yes, until today I still don't think I have done anything wrong, because the Battle of the Desolate Valley proved that my patience was worth it. But is Su Qingjun's way of thinking necessarily wrong? If I were the one being abused and suffered, would I look forward to having a friend like Su Qingjun? I don't know, Old Ma, I have never understood this matter. Old Ma was silent for a long time and said, "Forget it, don't think too much. That Miss Su is after all not the same kind of person as us." Lu Qin nodded and said, "Yes, I also thought of this before I made up my mind. Qingjun is cold on the outside but warm on the inside, kind-hearted, as if she has been standing in the light since she was a child. She is so different from me, a shadow." Old Ma pulled him towards the house and said with a smile, "Looking at your emotional appearance, could it be that you feel that you are not worthy of that Miss Su?" Lu Qin smiled and then shook his head, saying, "I don't mean that, but I have lived in the shadow all my life and am used to the darkness. So from now on, let me help her with those dark, dirty, and disgusting things. As for herself, she only needs to stand in the light." Old Ma couldn't help but laugh and looked at him mockingly, saying, You have suddenly become like a saint, scaring me to death. Come on, in fact, it is rare for you to see a beautiful and clean thing, so you can't bear to dirty it. Don't talk so much nonsense. So many of us have died in the past, but I have never seen you soften your heart. In the end, isn't it because Su Qingjun is young and beautiful, you like her?" Old Ma swayed his fat body, put his hands behind his back and walked into the bedroom disapprovingly. At the same time he said, "In this immortal city, black is black, white will eventually become black, don't be wishful thinking." Lu Qin stopped in his tracks and remained silent. He raised his head to look at the night sky and saw that the moon was bright and clear. However, upon closer inspection, he realized that there were still dark clouds drifting through the moonlight. The next morning, Lu Qin woke up Old Ma and prepared to go up the mountain to the Floating Clouds Agency. There were two things he wanted to do. First, it was the secret name list in Shui Ying's hands. Second, it was to find out how to continue hunting down the remnants of the evil cult. This kind of top-secret list would never be seen by ordinary people, but now Lu Qin's identity was completely different. As the well-known successor of Lord Tianlan, and it was obvious that that lord was doing his best to cultivate him, so Lu Qin's power and authority had increased rapidly overnight, even to the point where he could faintly compete with Shui Ying. Even Shui Ying was not willing to have an open conflict with Lu Qin at this time, so she readily agreed to Lu Qin's request. As Lu Qin's only good friend for many years, Old Ma's status had risen recently. He was very popular both inside and outside of Fiyunji, and everyone looked up to him. This made Old Ma very proud and he worked very hard. Therefore, around noon that day, Old Ma, who was in charge of searching for the list, suddenly ran to Fiyunji to find Lu Qin. At that time, Lu Qin was discussing with Shui Ying how to investigate the spies who had confessed. After all, they could not rely on the one-sided story of the devil cult's demons to kill and capture them. What if those people were deliberately speaking nonsense? When Old Ma came in, there was a clear, strange expression on his face. After bowing to Shui Ying, he walked to Lu Qin's side and said, "That woman called Song Hui, we found her, but there's a problem." Chapter 480. After walking out of Fiyunji, Lu Qin said to Old Ma, "Did you see Shui Ying's expression just now?" Old Ma nodded. "She's probably curious too. After all, your identity is different now. She'll think more about everything you do. It's human nature. But are you really not going to avoid her?" Lu Qin said, "I can't avoid her. Although you and I have been working in Fiyunji for many years, we can't compare to her in terms of our foundation in Immortal City. As long as the damn Baldy doesn't really intend to replace this woman, we'll need her help for many things in the future. So we might as well make it clear to her. Even if we want to investigate the past, we won't be able to do so without alerting her." That's true. Old Ma seemed to be well aware of this situation. What he said just now was more like a reminder to Lu Qin. When they got close to the Kunlun temple, Lu Qin looked around and saw that there was no one around. He asked, "What's the strange thing you mentioned just now?" Old Ma said, "I found Song Hui's name on Fiyunji's secret list. But in the records, Song Hui shouldn't be from Fiyunji." Lu Qin was startled, a trace of surprise on his face. Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "You've also figured it out. The secret list in Shui Ying's hands is commonly known as the shadow list in our Floating Clouds Agency. The names on it are all the most secret of shadows. But Song Hui's identity is a female disciple of Zheng Xianming's Grand Chancellor in the past. Apart from dying at the hands of the devil cult, there's almost nothing unusual about this woman's life." Lu Qin's brows slowly furrowed. He said, "It's not the Floating Clouds Agency's shadow, and there's nothing out of the ordinary about her. However, her name was included in this most secretive list?" Old Ma nodded with a hint of hesitation on his face. Lu Qin saw his expression and said, "What's wrong? What are you trying to say?" Old Ma said in a low voice, those who are on the shadow list will have their traces secretly erased by Fiyunji. In other words, if Song Hui doesn't have many friends and relatives, it's unlikely that anyone will remember her after a decade. Even if someone tries to investigate, they won't be able to find anything. Lu Qin fell silent. After a moment, he suddenly exhaled softly and said, just like me? Old Ma nodded and said, just like you. If one day he succeeded and survived, he might become famous in the world. However, if he gave up halfway and failed on the verge of success, then all his achievements, all his fame, even if he was a flesh and blood person, would eventually become a name on the list of shadows hidden in the darkness. But if he gave up halfway and failed on the verge of success, then all his achievements, all his fame, even if he was a flesh and blood person, would eventually become a name that would never see the light of day. The world had always been so cruel, even more so for the shadow in the dark. But why would a woman who wasn't a shadow be recorded on this list? Old Ma pondered and said, could it be that Song Hui is actually a shadow, but her identity is too important, so she needs to hide it? As soon as he finished speaking, he began to shake his head, probably feeling that his words didn't make sense. Next to him, Lu Qin also shook his head and said, that's impossible. The shadow list is the most secretive thing. Those who can be written on it are real people. There's no need to fake it. Old Ma sighed, nodded, and remained silent. Lu Qin frowned and thought for a while. Suddenly he asked, how does it record Song Hui's identity and how she died? When she was alive, she was a tax collector in the Dezayuan. On weekdays, she would be sent to some local industries to collect taxes. There are hundreds and thousands of tax collectors in the Dezayuan. They are the most ordinary people. As he said this, Old Ma glanced at Lu Qin and said, as for how she died, it's very simple. She was robbed by the devil cult's demons on the way to collect taxes. She couldn't defeat them and was taken away. In the end, she was tortured to death. Lu Qin fell silent. After a while he asked, what about her family? Are they still alive? Old Ma shook his head and said, they're all gone. Song Hui's parents had passed away before she was killed. She was also alone with no relatives. Lu Qin's expression suddenly changed. Old Ma immediately felt it and frowned. What's wrong? Lu Qin closed his eyes and the muscles on his face twitched slightly. He seemed to be in pain. Perhaps he was forced to recall those unpleasant memories again, which made him feel depressed and uncomfortable. After a while he whispered, there's something wrong. For some reason, Old Ma suddenly became nervous and asked, what is it? Lu Qin took a deep breath and said, recently I've been thinking about that incident. What left the deepest impression is not her name, but I remember that when a devil cult's demon was beating her, he seemed to know her a little. He laughed wildly and shouted that he would catch her sister in the future, and the two of them would be together. At that time, Song Hui was in a daze and was on the verge of death. When she heard this, she suddenly seemed to have regained her consciousness. She screamed and fought with the demon, but of course she couldn't beat him and was killed in the end. Old Ma was stunned and couldn't speak for a while. Lu Qin glanced at Old Ma and said indifferently, Song Hui does have a younger sister. She purposely made a mistake in the list. The two stood in front of the Kunlun Hall and looked in the direction of the Fiyunji Hall in front of them with different expressions. For a long time they didn't speak. This matter can't be investigated from Fiyunji anymore. After a long time Lu Qin finally spoke. He looked at the solemn and majestic Fiyunji Hall in the distance and said to Old Ma. Old Ma stood beside him with a complicated expression. After a moment of hesitation he said in a low voice, why don't we stop the investigation? I feel that there's something strange about this matter. Don't make a big mess. Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, we still have to investigate. It's fine if I don't remember or care about it in the past, but now that I think about it, I always feel that I owe that woman a little. If I give up now, I won't feel at ease. Just treat it as helping me pay off my debt. Old Ma sighed and said, okay, but we can't investigate Fiyunji anymore. What are you going to do? Lu Qin thought for a moment and said, we can only go to the Dezayuan. Don't alarm anyone. Just find some old people who have been in the Dezayuan for more than 10 or 20 years and ask around to see if anyone still remembers Song Hui. He paused for a moment. After a moment, his eyes suddenly flashed and he said, in addition, we have to ask about her sister. I have a feeling that Song Hui's erased sister may be the key to this mess. Chapter 481. Everything was chaotic and noisy, but the general situation of the world was as calm as before. Even after the explosion in the Immortal City, The scene was fiery and the casualties were heavy. It made the evil cult, which had been on the decline for a long time, suddenly become the focus of attention again. But in fact, this did not change or help the evil cult's momentum and actual situation. On the contrary, on the side of Zheng Xianming and Fuyunji, with the entrance of the underground palace that Lu Qin accidentally found, broke through the old nest that the evil cult had been operating in the Immortal City for many years, killed and captured many remnants of the evil cult. Except for the most mysterious leader Elder Ghost who was still on the run, it could be said that the evil cult's power in the Immortal City had been defeated in one fell swoop. Decades of hard work went down the drain. The result of this battle could be said to be unforgettable pain for the evil cult. However, Fuyunji did not relax because of this. After fighting with the evil cult for many years, they were experienced and their methods were ruthless. They had a deep meaning of extermination. Many of the evil cult's captives who were captured alive were questioned in Fuyunji's prison. Naturally, there were some punishments that could not be known by outsiders. In short, the result was that, after a few days of silence, Fuyunji once again launched a large-scale operation and carried out a thorough sweep of the remaining evil cult spies and hidden forces in the Immortal City. This was a swift, ferocious and thorough sweep. During this period, there were even quite a few spies caught within the true Immortal Alliance. There were quite a few people who usually didn't reveal any flaws, but this time, they were exposed by the confessions of the captives. These spies were all over the halls of Zheng Xianming. Although the total number was not particularly large, there were only a dozen of them, but even so, it was enough to shock people. In this storm-like arrest process, naturally there were people who cried injustice, some people were filled with righteous indignation, some people angrily rebuked, saying some heart-wrenching words, expressing their loyalty to their sex immortals. There were also some who accused Fuyunji of making a fuss, taking the opportunity to eliminate the strength of other immortals and so on. In short, these words attracted quite a bit of criticism. Even though it couldn't be considered to be a raging storm, there were still undercurrents surging in the true Immortal Alliance. Many halls found the overbearing and domineering floating clouds office to be an eyesore. In the end, the storm subsided. It was said that the big shots at the top sat down and had a chat. A bald perfected monarch showed some things to the other perfected monarchs. Then they chatted for a while and went their separate ways. Following that, Fuyunji stopped arresting people. Of course, it was also possible that they had already arrested all the people that they should have arrested. At the same time, the people from other halls also received verbal orders from their superiors. They only said that among those who were arrested, there were indeed many spies of the evil cult with conclusive evidence. Naturally, everyone did not make a ruckus anymore. However, although Fuyunji could be considered to have achieved a significant victory, they also restrained themselves a lot. Probably because they had received a secret warning, they were not as aggressive as before. In short, this period of time passed just like that. Things calmed down just like that. The power of the evil cult in Immortal City was basically uprooted. The world was at peace, the wind was calm and the waves were calm. Not to mention a storm, not even a ripple could be seen. Zheng Xianming, this behemoth, was the leader of the world. Millions of people submitted to it. It was in line with the phrase, prosperous and flourishing. Recently, White Lotus had been following Lu Qin. No matter where Lu Qin went, she was almost always by his side. If there was something, she would do it. If there was something, she would help. If there was nothing, she would stand at the side in a daze. In short, other than not sleeping in the same room at night, she was almost inseparable from Lu Qin. At least, she was always within Lu Qin's sight and never left his side. And because of this, Lu Qin, who had recently risen to fame and was regarded by Zheng Xianming as the biggest heir to the huge foundation of Lord Tianlan, also left an impression in Tianlong Mountain. That was, no matter where he went, there would always be two closest subordinates by his side. One was the fatty old Ma and the other was the extraordinarily beautiful young girl White Lotus. From time to time, old Ma would leave to help Lu Qin. But the outstanding and beautiful young girl never left Lu Qin's side. She seemed to be his guard, but also like a helper who could not leave his side for a moment. Some busybodies or people with ulterior motives secretly spread that even at night, White Lotus actually slept in the same room and on the same bed with Lu Qin. They said that this young girl was actually Lu Qin's concubine and so on. There were all kinds of exaggerations, ambiguities, scoldings and innuendo, which were not pleasant to hear. Of course, these rumors could not escape the ears of Fuyunji and would naturally spread to Lu Qin and the other two. In this regard, Lu Qin could do nothing. Oma just laughed it off. And White Lotus, who should have been the angriest, seemed to be the calmest. She was indifferent to this kind of dirty water that was poured on her and still followed Lu Qin closely every day. Even though Lu Qin had told her several times to avoid arousing suspicion, White Lotus still insisted on it. In the end, Lu Qin also gave up persuading her with a bitter smile. There were some things that no one could say, could not say and dared not say, but they would always have some premonitions. Looking at such a talented and outstanding-looking young girl, who should have been regarded as a treasure in the world, right now was living with fear and trepidation, it really made one sigh. But such indulgence also brought about other consequences. Other than attracting attention, every time Lu Qin met Su Qingjun recently, all he saw was a cold face and a disdainful gaze. This evening, the upstart trio of their Tianlan Supreme's faction once again walked out of that prison in Fuyunji. Perhaps it was because that kind of dirty and dark place always gave people a kind of gloomy mood. The expressions of the three of them did not look too good. After walking to one side, Old Ma sighed and said, "Still can't get an answer, what should we do?" Now that the evil sect's power in Immortal City was almost wiped out, the only unresolved hidden danger was that missing Elder Ghost. And among the evil sect's captives, the only one who had contact with Elder Ghost was Qin He. So during this period of time, they no longer paid attention to the others and only specifically questioned Qin He. But Qin He's willpower was unexpectedly strong. No matter what method Lu Qin and the rest used, they could not pry open his mouth. Even White Lotus, who had shone brilliantly in the interrogation previously, could not do it. Hearing Old Ma's words, Lu Qin did not have any reaction, but White Lotus, who was beside him, had already frowned, as if she was somewhat disgusted by Old Ma's words. But the truth was the truth. Even if she was unhappy, she could only endure it. She only intentionally or unintentionally glanced at Lu Qin's face, as if she was somewhat concerned about Lu Qin's meaning. Naturally, Lu Qin would not get angry or scold them. Speaking of which, the relationship between the three of them was also a little strange. Lu Qin and Old Ma were slightly better, after all they were old friends for more than 10 years, but White Lotus and them were not like subordinates, not like friends. Even if she wanted to scold them, it did not seem to be very good. After a moment of silence, Lu Qin still waved his hand and said, "Forget it, let's go back first." They walked all the way down the mountain. The sky slowly darkened as they walked. Unknowingly, they walked to the long street of Immortal City, and saw a familiar place in front of them was surrounded by a large piece of cloth. Lu Qin's footsteps paused and he said, "Isn't that the place where the explosion happened a few days ago? That entire restaurant was blown up. Why is it suddenly surrounded today?" White Lotus did not speak, but it was Old Ma who was well informed, and he said, "Oh, that side is going to be rebuilt. These days they have been filling that big pit, and at the same time preserving the entrance to the underground palace." As they spoke, the three of them suddenly felt something at the same time, and looked up together, only to see a cloud falling from the night sky, turning into a ray of light and directly falling behind the cloth, disappearing without a sound. Lu Qin glanced at Old Ma, and Old Ma understood and said in a low voice, "Now the underground palace below is not allowed to enter, including our people in Fuyunji. Those who go in and out are all people from the Starry Hall." Lu Qin was startled and he glanced over there, frowned and said, "Could it be that that person just now, is it Immortal Guyu? Why does he keep running underground for no reason? Why is he doing this every day?" Chapter 482. They stopped to watch, and as they discussed in private, they took a few steps closer to the place where the curtain was. Soon they were discovered by several guards standing there. Not long after, someone came over. The person who came did not have an overbearing attitude, and very politely told them that this place was now under the control of the Starry Hall of Zhengxianming, and that unrelated people were temporarily prohibited from approaching. If it caused inconvenience to everyone, please understand. In short, please take a deeder first. Lu Qin and the other two naturally would not look for trouble, so they immediately agreed and walked away. However, after leaving here, Old Ma was a little emotional and said to Lu Qin with a smile, "Look at the attitude of the people from the Starry Hall. They are peaceful and polite. If it were us in Fuyunji, probably a few people would surround them, scold them fiercely, and then tell them to get lost, right?" Lu Qin rolled his eyes and scolded with a smile, "Nonsense. Although we in Fuyunji do things in a domineering manner, when did we become so overbearing? Damn fatty, don't help outsiders. Besides, if this kind of words is heard by others and then spread to Blood Warbler or that damn Baldy, you will be out of luck." Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "Well, Lord Perfected Immortal, I guess it is unlikely that you will care about such a small matter, but if Hall Master Shui knows about it, it will indeed be a little troublesome. As he said this, he touched his head and sighed, in this world even the truth is not allowed to be spoken now? If you want to die, do it yourself, don't drag us down. Lu Qin glanced at him with contempt, then pulled White Lotus a few steps to the side and said with a smile, let's not walk with this idiot, or we will be dragged down by him sooner or later. White Lotus did not respond to him, nor did she have any other reaction. It seemed that she obediently followed Lu Qin a few steps, and her eyes flickered slightly as she looked at Lu Qin. And standing at the side, old Ma was also startled, a little surprised on his face. The surroundings suddenly became quiet, and Lu Qin suddenly came to his senses. He looked down and found that he was still holding White Lotus's wrist. He was shocked and quickly let go. White Lotus and old Ma both looked at him, and the atmosphere seemed to become awkward. Lu Qin smiled awkwardly, and after hesitating for a moment he said to White Lotus, this? My mind was suddenly confused just now. I seem to remember that you are still the 10-year-old girl on the mountain in Kunlun a few years ago. I suddenly forgot, sorry. White Lotus did not seem to be angry, but looked at Lu Qin strangely, and then nodded as if she had accepted Lu Qin's explanation. Who knew that old Ma, who was at the side, seemed to want to see the world in chaos. He stood there and snorted and said, what are you saying? Even if she is a 10-year-old girl, you can casually hold her hand? You obviously have ulterior motives. Hey! Lu Qin was furious and he kicked old Ma and shouted, damn fatty, you dare to slander me? Old Ma jumped to the side and laughed heartily. I'm just doing this because I can't bear to watch your evil deeds any longer. White Lotus, don't be afraid. If this guy dares to bully you, just tell me, I will definitely help you vent. Before the last sentence was finished, old Ma's buttocks had already been kicked by Lu Qin, and he immediately flew out and fell on his face. Lu Qin sneered, first, I am not that kind of disgusting person. Second, even if I am, you can't be the hero who saves the beauty. Old Ma patted his buttocks and stood up, looking unlucky, and muttered in a low voice, this guy, after becoming a disciple of a supreme, how did his cultivation improve so quickly? I don't see him cultivating at all. White Lotus, who was at the side, was a little surprised. Looking at these two big men scolding and laughing, she did not know why, in this quiet dark street in the dead of night, she felt a little warm. She smiled for no reason, her originally gloomy expression also became a lot more cheerful. At this moment, Lu Qin and old Ma, who had already run to the front, realized that she was still standing behind and watching. They stopped together, waved to White Lotus and said, hey, why aren't you walking, follow me? White Lotus smiled sweetly. In the darkness of the night, she was like a beautiful lily blooming, causing people's hearts to palpitate. With a clear sound of agreement, she quickly followed the two men. The three figures walked along the long street, leaving behind three blurry shadows walking side by side. Behind the erected cloth curtain was the entrance to the underground palace. After the light dispersed, a figure appeared underground. It was the master of Zhangxianmeng's Star Hall, Guyu Supreme. After walking through that long passage, the underground city that was wrapped in a strange red light appeared in front of him. Not long ago this was the lair of the devil sect in the Immortal City, but now it was completely occupied by Zhangxianmeng. Guyu Supreme squinted her eyes and looked at the strange blood moon above the dome. She pondered for a moment and then walked towards the center of the city. At this moment, in this huge underground city, it was no longer quiet like before. In many corners of the streets and alleys, there were Star Hall's disciples busy. Looking from afar, they seemed to be arranging something in some specific places, but those people's positions looked messy, and for a moment, one could not tell what they were doing. Guyu Supreme seemed to turn a blind eye to the many busy subordinates around him, walked along the largest and longest street, all the way to the strange half-body statue in the center of the underground city, and saw the bald true lord sitting cross-legged in the center of the entire city, slightly frowning as he looked up at the blood moon. The blood-red moonlight shone on his body, refracted from the top of his head, like a transparent gem, looking a little strange and funny. Guyu Supreme walked over and sat beside True Lord Tianlan. True Lord Tianlan turned his head to look at him, then said lightly, "Why do you look so bad?" Guyu Supreme shrugged and said, "It's rare for you to come down, of course you don't feel anything sitting here, but I stayed here for more than 10 days, the longer this blood corrosion power shone, the more harmful it is. In the end even I couldn't stand it, so I went up to hide for a while." True Lord Tianlan frowned, then turned to look at the other Star Hall's disciples in the city. Guyu Supreme understood what he meant and said, You don't have to worry about this, they are all rotated at most 24 hours, then they will go out. True Lord Tianlan nodded, retracted his gaze and at the same time, glanced at the nearby houses that were far taller than ordinary human houses. His eyes were a little gloomy. After a while, True Lord Tianlan said, I didn't expect this demon city to actually be perfectly preserved until now. Guyu Supreme also sighed, seemingly a little emotional, looked at those houses and said, yes, who would have thought? But it doesn't matter, they are just some empty houses as long as the demons who lived here back then don't come back. Come back. True Lord Tianlan smiled, there was a bit of coldness in his smile, and his eyes glanced at the ground, intentionally or unintentionally. Guyu Supreme obviously knew some things like him. He didn't show any strange expression towards True Lord Tianlan's attitude. Instead, he stretched out his hand and patted the ground lightly. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said, speaking of which, those sages of our human race, they were quite ruthless to the demons, right? Chapter 483. Ruthless. True Lord Tianlan smiled and said, if it's not ruthless, the ones that can be seen everywhere in this vast divine continent should be those fellows who call themselves the God race. As for us humans, we're probably still living the lives of livestock? True Lord Guyu looked up at the huge statue and suddenly said, I once read a saying in the ancient books of the Starry Hall. The 4 huge god statues in the immortal city are indomitable and as lofty as mountains, but their bellies are hollow, imprisoning the vengeful spirits of tens of millions of people who died in ancient times. True Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, you can't take it seriously if it's not true. The books of the demon race have basically all been burnt to ashes, and not a single word has been passed down. The pitifully few things that remain are also hidden in a place that only we can see, and they were all written by our own people. True Lord Guyu didn't seem angry, and seemed to agree with True Lord Tianlan's words. She smiled and nodded. True Lord Tianlan pondered for a moment, and a trace of solemnity appeared on his face. He asked True Lord Guyu, now that the blood moon has appeared and the ethereal palace is shaken, although there are still restrictions down there won't be any accidents, right? True Lord Guyu frowned slightly, and seriously pondered for a moment, as if going through all the possibilities she knew. Then she also very seriously said to True Lord Tianlan, no, as long as the restrictions at the exit of the ethereal palace don't move, there will definitely be no accidents. Moreover, the sages of the past also have a backup plan. Even if the formation at the exit of the ethereal palace is shaken, there's another more powerful restriction that can suppress all the demons and monsters. True Lord Tianlan raised his brows and said, there's actually such a thing and I actually didn't know about it. True Lord Guyu smiled and said, it's been too long and most people have forgotten about these things. Only my Starry Hall has passed down this restriction method since ancient times. It can be considered as a mission passed down by the ancestors, and I have always kept it in my heart, not daring to forget it. True Lord Tianlan's face revealed an extremely rare expression of respect. He tidied his clothes and slightly nodded towards True Lord Guyu, as if it was a respectful greeting. The usually easygoing Guyu True Monarch did not avoid it this time. She accepted the True Monarch's bow and said softly, on behalf of the ancestors and sages, I accept your bow. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. What's the second restriction formation? Can you tell me about it? True Monarch Guyu said, I naturally trust you. I won't hide it from you, but the biggest backup plan is actually our human race's ancestor, the sage, relying on the Xiangshan immortal city, and using the 4 divine beast statues built by the demon race as the formation core, he set up an unprecedented huge formation. Normally, this formation is concealed and can't be seen, but it can suppress the earth veins and gather spiritual energy. That's why our immortal city is known as the #1 spiritual mountain in the world. Perfected Lord Tianlan took a deep breath of air and said emotionally, so that's the reason behind it. After a pause he said in a low voice, but as far as I know, this outer formation has probably never really been used after it was completed, right? Perfected Lord Guyu smiled. This formation was originally meant to suppress the ethereal palace just in case, but all the unusual movements of the ethereal palace previously could not even shake the first restriction beneath our feet, so why would it need to be used? Perfected Lord Tianlan also smiled. After a while, he raised his head and looked at the source of the red moonlight above his head. He seemed to be deep in thought, then casually asked Perfected Lord Guyu, even when the blood moon is in the sky and the blood light is at its brightest, is it still fine? You must know that at that time, the magic power and cultivation of us human cultivators are all suppressed. It's considered the weakest time. Of course it's fine. Perfected Lord Guyu said without hesitation. I don't know how many times I've seen that formation. Its power is unimaginable, suppressing the demon race is nothing difficult. Perfected Lord Tianlan clapped his hands and laughed heartily. His smile was carefree as if he was finally relieved. Some time ago in the Immortal City, Zheng Xianming and Fiyunji's attack against the demonic sect could be said to have shaken the entire city, especially the seizure of the demonic sect's underground lair. It could be considered as the greatest victory since the Battle of the Desolate Valley more than 10 years ago. After that, Fiyunji pursued after the victory, using the captured captives to interrogate the remaining members of the demonic sect. They carried out another round of arrests and wiped out the demons of the demonic sect that were entrenched in the dark corners of the Immortal City. The world was bright, the righteous path was prosperous, the reputation of Fiyunji reached its peak in history at this time of the year. Probably the only thing that's not perfect is that we didn't catch that elder ghost? Walking on Tianlong Mountain, Old Ma said to Lu Chen and White Lotus with some emotion. If we really caught that old tortoise, we might really be able to completely uproot the demonic sect. Then we can be considered to have completed the great cause that many generations of heroes have not been able to do. It's enough to leave our names in history. Lu Chen smiled. White Lotus, who was beside him, took a look at him and said with some surprise, "You actually still want to leave your name in history?" Old Ma rolled his eyes and said seriously, "What's with that expression of yours? What do you mean I still want to leave my name in history? Let me tell you too, as long as it's a human, they all have the heart of fame and wealth, it's just a matter of how big or small it is. No matter what, I'm also an old man who has been fighting with the demonic sect for decades. If I really defeat these evildoers, it's not too much for me to ask for a name in the future generation, right?" Lu Chen smiled and did not speak, and White Lotus, for the past few days, for some reason, her mood suddenly improved a lot. Although she was still cold to outsiders, but towards Lu Chen and Old Ma she was much closer. Hearing that, she smiled and said, "But in the world of righteous path, who knows how many people are fighting with the demonic sect? Why do you say that others only remember you?" Old Ma was speechless for a moment. After a long silence, he revealed a bitter expression and said, "Then what can we do? There are indeed countless righteous people in this world. We don't have any benefits. Don't tell me we can't even have a name?" White Lotus glanced at the person next to her, then pointed to Lu Chen and said, "No, in the future he will be immortalized. This Lu Chen, or Tianing name, is destined to be praised by many people in the future." Lu Chen was startled, his smile slightly disappeared. Old Ma was somewhat unconvinced and said, "On what basis?" White Lotus shrugged and said, "On the basis that he is the disciple of Huashan Jinjuan, on the basis that his natural position is higher than yours, on the basis that he now ascends to the sky in one step and holds great power. In the future everyone may say that the reason why we can defeat the demonic sect is all because of Tianlan Jinjuan and Lu Chen, master and disciple pair of diligent efforts, risking their lives to achieve it." Old Ma was speechless. After a long while he murmured, "This difference is too big. Just because his reputation is greater than mine? Isn't it enough that his reputation is greater than yours?" White Lotus sneered and said, "You are the same as me, just an ordinary person among the masses, always just a shadow following behind him. You have nothing, no identity, no status, no achievements, or even if you have achievements no one knows, then on what basis do you still have delusions of wanting to be immortalized?" "Enough." A shout came from the mouth of Lu Chen, his face a little dark, looking at White Lotus with a frown and said, "We were just having a good conversation, why did we suddenly talk about this irrelevant topic? As long as we don't find that Elder Gue, the demonic sect will always be in danger of resurrection. How can we have so many thoughts of being immortalized? Let's quickly go ask that Chen He again." With that said, he strode towards the prison that had already appeared in front of them. Behind him, Old Ma sighed, waved to White Lotus and then followed. White Lotus pursed her lips, her eyes fell on the back of Lu Chen. After a moment she snorted and slowly walked over, at the same time muttering in a low voice, "It's just a guilty conscience. I don't believe you can catch that old turtle. If you really catch him, how many people in Fiyunji will?" Chapter 484. Out of the three of them, only Lu Chen and White Lotus entered Fiyunji's prison. As for Old Ma, for the past few days he followed them to this place to casually stroll around and then left by himself. As for where he was going, he never told Lu Chen and White Lotus, and Lu Chen also did not ask him, as if he already knew. Currently, the number of evil sect demon captives imprisoned in this prison was already quite a lot, but to Lu Qin and White Lotus, most of them basically had no value to interrogate. The only thing they were interested in was the news of that missing ghost elder, and the only person who could provide a statement here was only one person, that was Chen He. Chen He's days were very miserable and also very bitter. The Fuyun Si and the devil cult had been fighting for so many years, so naturally, they also had many sinister and ruthless methods in the dark. And the fairy-like young lady from a few days ago was also a formidable character. She was so young and incomparably savage, torturing him until he hovered between life and death. Just that for some reason he still did not speak and kept silent. However, in the past few days he also noticed that those who came to interrogate him were usually those 2 or 3 people. The strange thing was, the one who used his mouth to interrogate him was always that little girl, and the other man always stood at the side without saying a word, from the beginning to the end, looking at him but never said a word. Who was that person? He was tortured until he was a little delirious. Sometimes his mind was blank, sometimes he felt that the man seemed somewhat familiar, but sometimes he also felt that he was very strange. Chen He had already lost all hope towards his own fate. He even started to become numb from the day after day of torture, woodenly waiting for the arrival of the day of death and pain. Just that today he was like a dog being dragged out of the prison by those fiendish prison guards. He thought it would be another day of unbearable pain, but very quickly, he discovered that today seemed to be somewhat different. The path he took today was different from usual. That disgusting and frightening interrogation room appeared in his sight as usual, but those guards still dragged Chen He, who was already riddled with scars, still wearing heavy shackles and could not even walk on his own, and continued to walk forward. After walking past the interrogation room, they walked forward for a while and came to another room. They opened the door and then threw Chen He in. Pung! Chen He fell heavily on the ground. Those Fuyunji guards never had any sympathy for these evil sect demons, and then with another muffled sound they closed the door. The room seemed to be very quiet, and did not seem to have the usual blood stench and stench of this prison. Chen He panted heavily, gritting his teeth as he struggled to prop his body up and looked around. This seemed to be a quiet room, but the room was empty. There were no furnishings including the 4 walls. There were only 2 people standing in front of him. Chen He opened his eyes wide and after a moment, saw the 2 familiar faces, and could not help but smile bitterly. It was Lu Qin and White Lotus. They stood in this empty room, but at the same time, there were no disgusting and frightening torture tools and blood. White Lotus's expression looked a little strange, and on this day, it was Lu Qin who stood in front, and she quietly stood behind. Chen He fell back to the ground, quietly lying on the flat floor. For a moment he actually felt a trace of happiness. Since when did a moment of peace and tranquility, without the stench of blood, and without pain and punishment become an extravagant hope? Footsteps sounded, and after a moment, a pair of feet appeared beside his head. Chen He struggled to turn his head and saw Lu Chen's face. Lu Chen squatted down beside him, looked at Chen He and said, "Do you recognize me?" Chen He looked at him in a daze and then shook his head. Lu Chen thought for a moment, and then glanced at his almost unscathed body, and then sighed and said, "Almost 20 years, you are the toughest evil sect person I have ever seen." Chen He did not know how to react and thought, could this sentence be a compliment, or was it full of malicious mockery, or in the following time, they would use even more vicious torture methods to torture people? Lu Chen took a box from his side, placed it by his feet, and then took out a small stool from somewhere, sat beside Chen He who was lying on the ground and said indifferently, "The shackles cannot be removed, the other parts of your body will hurt, bear with it." Chen He did not understand the meaning of this sentence and was stunned. Suddenly he heard a crisp sound and a piercing pain came from his chest. Chen He instinctively howled and his body trembled uncontrollably. In Lu Chen's hand was a piece of tattered cloth, and it was a piece of Chen He's clothes on his chest. After many days of torture, his flesh was badly mutilated, and these clothes had already stuck together with his flesh. He directly tore it off, and immediately the wound on Chen He's chest was torn open and blood flowed out. Chen He groaned in pain, but Lu Chen remained indifferent. He only frowned slightly as he looked at Chen He's chest. Under the incomparably filthy black prisoner's uniform, the flesh on this prisoner's chest had already turned black and rotted. Lu Chen shook his head. With an indifferent expression, he stretched out his hand again and tore at the air repeatedly with a swish. Chen He suddenly screamed, and his hoarse voice reverberated in the quiet room. It was even more mournful than the sound of a pig being slaughtered. White Lotus, who was standing at the side, frowned, and looked at Lu Chen with a complicated expression. This continued for a while, and Lu Qin had already torn off all of Chen He's clothes including his pants. It was only because White Lotus was a girl that he still left him a pair of underwear. But looking at it now, Chen He's wretched state could be seen. It was truly a body with cuts and bruises all over, and it could be seen that he had recently been severely tortured. Lu Qin threw away the tattered cloth in his hand, and then opened the box by his feet. After a moment, he carried a jar over and casually opened the stopper. A strong smell of alcohol floated out. "This is an extremely strong liquor. Do you want to drink it?" Lu Qin asked Chen He. Chen He was still panting, and at the same time he looked at Lu Qin, but there was no fear in his eyes. He grinned and said in a hoarse voice, "Drink." Lu Qin smiled, and with a flick of his wrist, a white liquid poured out. Chen He immediately opened his mouth wide, greedily catching this rare liquor, and swallowed it in big mouthfuls. In the quiet room, the sound of gurgling could be heard incessantly. When he didn't have time to drink, the strong alcohol splashed from his mouth and landed on the wounds on his body. The pain made Chen He spasm and tremble. This was about 30% of the wine in the jar. Lu Qin stopped. Chen He gulped down the last mouthful of strong liquor, panting as if he had not had enough. He let out a long sigh and said, "That was satisfying." Lu Qin said lightly, "A lot of the rotten flesh on your body needs to be cut off or else you won't live. Just treat this liquor as a rinse. If you can bear it, then bear it. If you can't, then faint." Chen He was startled, and before he could speak, he saw Lu Qin pour the jar of liquor on his chest. The burning pain immediately made Chen He scream. However, from the corner of his eye, he saw a black dagger in Lu Qin's hand. The dagger pierced his chest, and with a flick of his wrist, a piece of black rotten flesh was cut off. Blood splattered, and Chen He's scream seemed to shake the entire prison. But halfway through his scream, his eyes rolled back and he fainted. Chapter 485. Fainting in severe pain is said to be a self-protective response of the human body, but sometimes a more intense or more prolonged pain can cause a person to wake up from a coma. That was what happened to Chen He that day. After a low growl, his originally unconscious body trembled and woke up again. Then his face was distorted and he was sweating profusely. However, he did not panic. He had already experienced the same intense pain during this period of time in the terrifying interrogation room. Of course, this did not mean that he would feel better after experiencing it. On the contrary, this kind of pain could easily make people wish they were dead. Despite the intense pain, Chen He could still see that the wounds on his body, chest, and abdomen had been bandaged with a clean white cloth. At the same time, the wounds under the white cloth were still painful, but they were much less painful. There was even a cool feeling coming from the wounds. This was clearly a sign that healing medicine had been applied on the wounds. However, there was still intense pain coming from his body. That was because Lu Qin hadn't pulled back yet. He was still holding onto Chen He's right arm, calmly treating the wound. Chen He endured the pain and looked at him. He found that Lu Chen's treatment method was abnormally rough and direct. He first checked the skin wounds, and if there was any rotten and smelly flesh, he would directly cut it with the black dagger. If the injury was slightly lighter, such as the skin being torn open, he would directly pour liquor on it and rinse it. These two methods were enough to make people wish they were dead. Even a tough person like Chen He could not stop screaming and gasping for breath. His head was covered in cold sweat and his body was trembling. Not long after, Lu Qin finished treating the wounds on his right arm. Then he took out some ointment from the box beside him and applied it to the wound. Then he took out a clean white cloth and bandaged it. Soon the terrifying pain subsided a lot and a cool feeling came from the wound. "Why?" Chen He looked at Lu Qin and asked in a low voice, as if he had finally managed to take a breather from the effective but excruciating healing. Lu Qin looked at him, then walked to the other side of his body with the tools in his hand and sat down. He picked up Chen He's left arm and examined it. At the same time he said faintly, "You are a person who is useful to me, but if you continue to be tortured like this, even if you don't die, you will go crazy." Chen He was silent. Everyone's body and will had a limit. Once the last line was crossed, people would die, or if they were pushed too far they would go crazy. Chen He was very determined to keep the secret, but he really felt that he could not hold on any longer. No one could continue to endure such intense pain for a long time. Hiss! Suddenly Chen He let out a low groan and sucked in a breath of cold air. It was Lu Qin who had sliced off a piece of rotten flesh from his arm. Fresh blood gushed out. Chen He's face was as white as paper and he almost fainted again. He clenched his teeth and looked at Lu Qin calmly treating the wound. Suddenly, A few words came out from between his teeth. "Thank you." Lu Chen looked up at him and said, "What are you thanking me for? Maybe I will make you suffer even more in the future." Chen He sneered, panting as he leaned his head on the ground and said, "Just come." Lu Chen smiled. Seeing that the wound was almost treated, he took out the medicine and started to apply it. After a while, Chen He suddenly asked, "Should I know you?" This time Lu Chen did not raise his head. He calmly said, "More or less. I am called Lu Chen. I used to stay in the evil faction. If you have stayed in the sect long enough and your position is high enough, you will probably know my other name." "What name?" Chen He frowned and asked. "Black Wolf." "Black Wolf?" Chen He repeated the name twice. Suddenly his face changed. Then the way he looked at Lu Chen was completely different. He stared at Lu Chen and said in a hoarse voice, "It's that barren valley? Yes, I did it." Lu Chen said cleanly. Chen He let out a beast-like roar. Suddenly, his body rose up as if he was about to burst out with unimaginable power and pounced towards Lu Chen. But before he could raise his arm that was wrapped in white cloth, Lu Chen's palm had already slapped him on the cheek. A crisp and heavy slap directly slapped Chen He to the ground. A line of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. His whole body was pressed against the ground, gasping for breath. However, the pain did not end. Without waiting for him to take another breath, suddenly, a heart-wrenching pain came from his thigh, causing Chen He to scream miserably, as if he had used all his strength to shout. White Lotus, who was standing at the side, frowned. She watched as Lu Chen stepped on the wound on Chen He's thigh with a deadpan expression. At the same time he kept twisting and rubbing, causing Chen He's whole body to tremble. He looked like a mad dog. She then looked at the bandaged wounds on Chen He's upper body, and then looked at Lu Chen's completely different behavior from before. She couldn't help but think, is this guy a lunatic in his heart? After Chen He screamed for a while, Lu Chen moved his foot away from his wound and then squatted down in front of him. Looking at Chen He's face covered in cold sweat, his distorted and trembling face, he said calmly, "Do you know your situation now?" Chen He gasped, then looked up at him, nodded and even gritted his teeth and smiled. Although the smile was uglier than crying, he said, "I understand." Lu Chen stared at him for a moment, then nodded and said, "You are a smart person." Lu Chen turned around and acted as if nothing had happened. As if nothing had happened, he began to help Chen He treat the wounds on his legs. But after being trampled by his vicious foot, the wound on Chen He's thigh was at least half as serious, causing Chen He to suffer a lot more. In the process of treating him, Lu Chen suddenly said, "Recently when I watched you being tortured, I often thought of one thing. If I had exposed my identity in the devil cult, I would probably have suffered the same fate as you. At that time, would I be able to endure the pain like you?" As he spoke, the blade in his hand did not stop. Chen He was in so much pain that he was sweating and seeing stars, but he couldn't even answer. Fortunately, Lu Chen didn't seem to care about his answer. After a moment of silence, he seemed to be talking to himself. "Later I understood I can endure it." Although he was in extreme pain, Chen He still glanced at him with some contempt, probably because he didn't believe Lu Chen's words. Lu Chen didn't explain anything to him. He just calmly did his own thing and then said calmly, "So, I asked myself, why do I feel that I can endure it?" After he said this, not only Chen He but even White Lotus also looked over. Lu Chen smiled and continued to say arrogantly, "Later I understood because at that time I really believed in something and firmly believed in it even at the risk of my life. So I am not afraid of death nor am I afraid of pain. No matter how much pain I can endure it." An ordinary person wouldn't be able to endure such intense pain. Those who are able to endure it and remain clear-headed must have some kind of belief in their hearts that supports them, making them unwavering. If they aren't even afraid of death, why would they be afraid of pain? Am I right? Lu Chen looked at Chen He and said lightly, "So, I'm very curious, what exactly is in your heart that makes you so stubbornly endure until now, and would rather die than betray Elder Gue? Is it that old tortoise who has done you a great favor? Or do you have something on you, like a relative being held hostage? Or you firmly believe in the legend of the devil cult, and think that the three realms will be unified sooner or later, and the devil cult will be the final home of the human race, right?" Lu Chen smiled and said to Chen He, "Which one is it? Can you tell me about it?" Chapter 486. Chen He did not say a single word to Lu Chen. In fact, after Lu Chen said those harsh words to him, although his face changed and his expression was complicated, he did not say a word, Even his eyes were closed, like a living dead lying on the ground motionless. No matter how Lu Qin tormented him, there was no reaction. However, Lu Qin didn't seem to be angry. He still used the original method to deal with the wounds on Qin He's body, with the kind of rough method that made people's teeth hurt. After bandaging, after everything was done, he stood up, clapped his hands and said, "Today you will stay here first, don't go back to the prison, I will come again tomorrow, I hope you will tell me the truth then." After speaking, he called out to White Lotus, and then the two of them left the quiet room. When the door was closed, White Lotus glanced at Qin He, who was lying on the ground, found that the prisoner's body was mostly wrapped in white cloth, looking very comical. At this moment, he was still lying on the ground motionless, as if he was indifferent to any movement in the outside world, a little like he had isolated himself. "Why are you so polite to this evil sect demon?" After walking out of the Fuyunji prison, White Lotus couldn't help but ask Lu Qin. Lu Qin looked at her strangely, said, "Do you have enmity with the evil sect? You look like you can't wait to torture them to death." White Lotus shook her head, said, "There is no enmity, even what I did a few days ago." She shook her head, her face was a little sad, but she did not continue, only said, "But don't the whole world think that they are crazy demons who stir up trouble? Why do you have to be so polite to them and even treat their injuries? Wouldn't it be better to directly torture them? The problem is, any kind of torture seems to be useless against this person now." Lu Qin said, "These days you have been following me and even did it yourself, I don't need to say this, right?" White Lotus was speechless. What Lu Qin said was naturally right, to be honest, although because of the secret method she cultivated, sometimes her heart was more ruthless, but it was really the first time she saw someone like Qin He who could withstand such torture. "If it was you, do you think you can survive this period of time?" Lu Qin asked her in return. White Lotus was silent. After a while she shook her head, said in a low voice, "No." Lu Qin nodded and said, "That's right. Since punishment is useless, let's try something else. Humans, no matter how tough He gang is, the body will always like comfort. When it is comfortable, the spirit will be relaxed. We will wait until he relaxes, maybe there will be a chance." White Lotus frowned, said, "Why so many twists and turns? Can it really work?" Lu Qin said with a smile, "Anyway, we can't ask now, right? Let's give it a try. At worst, I will let you beat him back to his original state later." White Lotus took a few steps forward, suddenly looked back at Lu Qin, a strange light flashed in her eyes. Lu Qin said, "What's wrong? Why are you looking at me like this?" White Lotus hesitated for a moment, but still shook her head and said, "Nothing." The two walked to the front of the Kunlun Hall. Lu Qin went over to ask and learned from the respectful guard at the door that Supreme Tianlan went out early in the morning and had not returned yet. Lu Qin walked back and said to White Lotus, "I have something to talk to Death Ray, my master. Now I am waiting for him here, but I don't know when he will come back. You don't have to accompany me here or go home and rest first." White Lotus was obviously stunned for a moment, then said, "Oh," nodded to him, turned around and walked away. Lu Qin watched her walk away, then turned around to greet the guards at the door of the hall, and said with a smile, "I will wait in the hall." The guards all agreed with a smile. The identity of the person in front of them had now been announced to the world. He was the most favored disciple of Supreme Tianlan, and according to Supreme Tianlan's recent performance, there was a great possibility that this huge foundation would be handed over to him in the future. As the palace guards of a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, it was natural for them to be highly skilled and loyal. With their status, they could be rude to most of the people in the alliance of true immortals, including some powerful nascent soul-perfected cultivators. However, when it came to this young master, the guards were all smiles and hurriedly sent him in without the slightest intention of stopping him. However, when Lu Qin's one foot had just crossed the threshold, suddenly a call came from behind. He looked back and was startled for a moment. It was White Lotus who had returned, and was standing on the stone steps of the Kunlun Hall. Lu Qin walked over, a little puzzled, and asked, "What's wrong? Is there anything else?" White Lotus's expression was complicated, and she said in a low voice, "I'm not tired and I'm not in a hurry and it's almost dark. I'll wait for you here, and when you're done we can go back together." Lu Qin stared at her for a while, then nodded and said, "If that's the case, wait for me here for a while." "Okay." White Lotus replied, and then really sat down on the white stone steps. Lu Qin entered the main hall of Kunlun and looked around. He had come to this place many times, and every time he came he felt that it was empty, especially this time when he was alone. There was a particularly cold and lonely feeling. That damn Baldy must have sat alone in this huge hall many times in the past. I wonder what his mood is like and if he also feels a little lonely. Thinking of this, Lucien quickly shook his head and laughed, thinking that damn Baldy is not a normal person. The thoughts and feelings that ordinary people have must not make sense to him. The tall lotus throne in the hall sat there conspicuously, and below it was a chair. Lucien went over and sat down casually and then quietly waited. This wait went on for a long time and he did not know where Supreme Tianlan had gone, and did not come back. But the sky outside finally gradually darkened, and dark clouds gathered in the sky. Dusk was approaching, and there seemed to be a storm in the sky. Lucien did not seem to have any reaction to the change of the weather outside, and still quietly sat and waited. Finally, after the sky outside darkened, when the first thunder sounded, a tall figure appeared at the door and walked in. The guards at the door of the main hall seemed to have received an order, and one after another they all retreated. After a while, the figure of Supreme Tianlan appeared in front of Lucien, looked at him with a trace of a smile and very calmly said, "I heard that you have something to talk to me about?" "Yes." Lucien stood up and did not say too much nonsense and very directly said, "It's about the matter of pursuing the evil sect Elder Ghost. Among all the evil sect demons that have been caught, only one called Qin he knows about Elder Ghost, but this person is very stubborn, even punishment cannot make him yield, so I think—" Boom! A flash of lightning suddenly flashed, a sound of thunder exploded in the sky, suddenly interrupting Lucien's words, and then there was only the sound of water splashing, and it was raining heavily outside. In the darkness of the night, candles had not been lit in time in the main hall, and it seemed a little dark, and probably because Supreme Tianlan had given the order beforehand, so those servants did not come to light the fire. The master and disciple stood facing each other in the darkness. Lucien was just about to continue when he suddenly saw Supreme Tianlan suddenly raise his hand, and stopped him, and at the same time turned his head to look at the main hall's entrance. Lucien followed his gaze and his brows also slowly furrowed. Outside the empty main hall, amidst the sudden gale and bitter rain, there was a lonely and frail figure sitting on the stone steps when a flash of lightning occasionally illuminated the front of the hall. The figure curled up motionlessly, allowing the wind and rain to batter the figure, drenching his clothes and hair. He looked lonely and extremely pitiful. Supreme Tianlan turned around and looked at Lucien again. A trace of a bitter smile appeared on Lucien's face and he sighed. Just when he was about to say something, he suddenly saw the cold expression on Supreme Tianlan's face, with some coldness as he said, "This girl is pretending to be crazy, deliberately sitting there in the rain and wind, pretending to be pitiful for you to see, nothing more than to make you soft-hearted and protect yourself. At such a young age, her heart is detestable, she deserves to die." Boom. Another clap of thunder sounded in the sky. Lucien's expression was indifferent, only his pair of eyes violently contracted. Chapter 487. Lightning tore through the dark sky and split the night sky in half like a huge lightsaber in the storm. It also illuminated the dark world at that moment. Lucien raised his head and looked at the person in front of him. Perfected Lord Tianlan stood in the dark hall. He was tall and burly and had a cold and angry expression on his face. He looked like a glaring Vajra and a demonic god, instilling fear in people. For so many years, he had always been high and mighty like a god, looking down on all living beings and holding the lives and hopes of countless people in his hands. His eyes were as deep as the ocean and his gaze fluctuated like turbulent waves. He was also staring at Lucien. In this magnificent hall, there was a short period of time when it suddenly became quiet and no one spoke. The figure on the stone steps outside the hall was still sitting in the wind and rain, enduring the harsh wind and rain. "Is there a need to do this?" "She's just a child," Lucien said in a low voice. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and said, "You were also a child when you entered the devil cult. What did you do later?" Lucien's expression changed and he said, "She's still young and can't be compared to me. Back then I was taught by you. She won't be so ruthless." "Who was the one who repeatedly tortured the captive of the devil cult these few days?" Perfected Lord Tianlan interrupted him and said with some mockery, "That method is much stronger than when you were at this age, right?" "She hates me and you." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lucien and said calmly, "Go and kill her." "Me? Why? You can't do it?" "But she's a disciple of Kunlun after all. Moreover, she's a rare five-pillar talent." "I can't? She's Bai Chen's last disciple." Perfected Lord Tianlan interrupted him. Lucien immediately stopped talking. After a while, he sighed and said, "At the end of the day, this is the reason why she should die. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a deep gaze. Is this reason enough? Lu Qin fell silent. After a while he said in a low voice, enough. Why must I kill her myself? The moment Lu Qin stepped out of the main hall of Kunlun, his conversation with Perfected Lord Tianlan was still echoing in his mind. Even at that moment, even if he did not turn around, he could still feel the pair of cold eyes staring at his back. You are my successor. If you don't do this, who will? He knew that Baldy had always been paranoid. He knew that Baldy loved to play with people's hearts. He knew that this person was probably the most terrifying madman in the world. He also knew that, based on past experience, Baldy had almost never been wrong. A madman who almost never makes a mistake. Pa. Lu Qin walked out of the eaves of the main hall and into the storm. His feet stepped into a puddle on the ground. Sparkling water droplets flew into the air and transformed into a strange glow in the air. The girl sitting on the steps trembled slightly as if she had sensed something. However, she did not turn around. She hugged her body tightly as if a bone-chilling cold was piercing through her body. She looked delicate and pitiful, like a delicate spring flower about to wither in the wind and rain. In the blink of an eye, the wind and rain had drenched Lu Chen's body, but he did not seem to feel it at all. In the dark hall behind him, there was a tall and burly figure standing by the door, looking at his back indifferently. His figure seemed to have merged with the night, turning into the omnipresent night sky that surrounded the two people in the wind and rain. Lu Chen walked over step by step. At some point, a black dagger had appeared in his right hand. Every step he took was accompanied by wind, rain, and splashes of water. In the pouring rain, a strange power seemed to be slowly rising in the dark night, forcing the curtain of water aside and opening up a path that led straight to that weak and helpless figure. White Lotus finally stood up and slowly turned around. She looked at the expressionless Lu Chen walking over, and also saw the black dagger in his hand. Her face was covered with rainwater droplets. She looked somewhat miserable and haggard, as if she had finally fallen into despair. Then, in a helpless voice, she said to Lu Chen, "Why? Did I not do well enough?" Lu Chen stopped in front of her and looked into her eyes. After a while he said, "Sometimes in this world there are those unreasonable things that happen." White Lotus sorrowfully looked at him and mournfully said, "But I still want to live." Lu Chen said, "But he wants you to die." White Lotus stared at him as if using all her heart and hope and said in a low voice, "Save me, can you?" Lu Chen's gaze seemed to dim for a moment, as if thinking of something from the past, or perhaps feeling something. But after a moment he still opened his mouth and said, "I can't save you." He raised his hand holding the dagger and then stabbed out. The black dagger pierced through the curtain of rain and water. At that moment, the world seemed to suddenly slow down, and perfectly round water droplets shot out in all directions. White Lotus's despairing and terrified gaze, the cold rain falling on her face like flying teardrops, and behind Lu Chen, countless black shadows suddenly appeared, like ghosts suddenly appearing in the darkness, wildly shouting. There was also a bolt of lightning that suddenly struck down from the sky. In the depths of the wind and rain, there was a tall and dark figure. He stared at her from afar. Just that gaze made White Lotus not dare to breathe, not dare to resist. She could only subconsciously reach out with her hands and grab the dagger, but she was powerless to stop it. She could only watch as the dagger pierced towards her chest. Lu Chen understood White Lotus. He knew that this young girl looked pure and innocent, but in reality she had a viciousness and strength that could not be underestimated. But in the next moment he was shocked. White Lotus's almost powerless reaction caught him off guard. That dagger pierced straight into her chest. The wind and rain soaked the young girl's clothes, and drops of water fell from her cheeks. Her hands grabbed the black dagger, and then dark red blood flowed from her palms, slowly dripping down along the blade. The black dagger pierced through her clothes and into her chest. Enough! Suddenly, a voice came from the hall, like a clap of thunder echoing in the dark night. Lu Chen's expression changed. With a low groan, he lowered his wrist and bent his body. With a light shout, the dagger was pulled back with a spray of blood. White Lotus's body was on the verge of collapse. Lu Chen hugged her and suddenly looked back, only to see that in the distant hall, the tall and sturdy figure had already turned around. He seemed to casually wave his hand, and as he walked he said, "Spare her life." Before he finished speaking, his figure had already disappeared into the darkness. There was no reason, no explanation. Lu Chen stared blankly in that direction and suddenly lowered his head, only to see that White Lotus's chest already had a wound and blood was gushing out. The young girl's face was as pale as paper, and she was already unconscious. He roared angrily, and with a wave of his hand, the black dagger disappeared in an instant. When his hand reached out from his bosom, there was already a jade bottle. With a crack, Lu Qin directly crushed the bottle with the red plum pattern, and then stuffed an elixir into White Lotus's mouth. Then he carried White Lotus and rushed down the mountain. In the wind and rain, the great hall stood majestically. On the lotus throne, true Lord Tianlan sat like a demon god, his expression solemn as he gazed into the distance. After an unknown period of time, he slowly nodded, a trace of satisfaction on his face. Chapter 488. Boom. Another clap of thunder exploded in the sky. There was no one in front of or behind the great hall. There was only the seemingly endless wind and rain beating against their faces, and further away, there seemed to be a boundless sea of darkness. Lu Qin followed the mountain path down the mountain, but just as he passed the Fuyunji Great Hall ahead, he suddenly stopped, looked down at White Lotus in his arms. Under the lightning that flashed across the sky, the ice-cold raindrops slapped against White Lotus's face, making her face pale like paper without the slightest trace of blood. However, amidst this miserable wind and bitter rain, the young girl seemed to have suddenly lost all pretense. She didn't have that elegant and otherworldly temperament, nor did she have that vicious and ruthless appearance. She was like a weak little beast that only had pain and fear left, curling up and nestling in Lu Chen's embrace. White Lotus's clothes on her chest, there was still blood gushing out incessantly, as if it could not be stopped. Lu Chen frowned as he swept the surroundings with his gaze, and then he suddenly turned around and flashed towards another direction. Not long after, that familiar row of houses appeared in his field of vision, silently standing in the raging storm. Lu Chen carried by Lien and sprinted away, sweeping across the long street in the heavy rain. When he arrived in front of one of the houses, he suddenly stopped in his tracks and stopped his body. The remaining force of his footsteps suddenly splashed water on the flagstone road like a waterfall, splashing into the air. And Lu Chen did not have the slightest hesitation, exerting force with his feet, his entire body soared into the air, carrying White Lotus over that high wall, flying into that house, landing in front of the bedroom door. As soon as his feet touched the ground, water splashed everywhere, but his surroundings suddenly became quiet. Perhaps it was because the four towering walls blocked the outside world, or perhaps it was because a chilling aura suddenly filled the air. Lu Chen did not have the slightest hesitation, directly pushed the door, just that at this moment, in that already dark bedroom, suddenly a light low shout, that door abruptly opened, the miserable wind and rain outside the house instantly rushed into the darkness. But the next moment, together with that darkness, all of the rain and wind in an instant were all swept back. A blazing, bright, and dazzling sword light emerged from the darkness like a bolt of lightning. It was peerlessly swift and fierce, and it carried the momentum of a storm as it pierced towards Lu Chen from the darkness. Lu Chen took a step back, did not retaliate, did not evade, only whispered urgently, "It's me." The sword light shone brightly, breaking through the air, as if to cut through everything, as if to kill all enemies. Lu Chen's pupils shrank, but he still stood where he was. In a flash, that sword light had already arrived. And then, abruptly stopped. The light slowly dispersed, a long sword stretched out from that house, the body of the sword as bright as autumn water, the incomparably sharp sword tip, pointing right at the space between Lu Chen's eyebrows. Inside and outside the house, the sound of the wind and rain, the cold wind blew past, it was as silent as before. Thunder rumbled in the sky, lightning flashed, illuminating the dark night for a moment, saw the girl standing behind the door, holding the sword, cold and beautiful, just like the day they first met. In a trance, it seemed that many years had passed. So imprinted in his heart, he had not forgotten. The two of them looked at each other. They could clearly see Su Qingjun standing behind the door, her surprised eyes and the complicated emotions that followed. After a while, she still slowly put down the sword in her hand, a little surprised said, "Why is it you?" Lu Chen did not have time to reminisce with her at this moment, suddenly took a step forward and said in a deep voice, "It's urgent, help me save someone." Only then did Su Qingjun notice that he was carrying White Lotus in his arms, and that his breathing was obviously not right, as well as the wound on his chest that was dyed red with blood. Immediately her expression changed and she cried out involuntarily, "White Lotus? How did she suffer such a serious injury?" Lu Chen took a deep breath, pushed White Lotus into her arms and said, she is an unmarried girl, and the wound is in a private place. It is really not good for me to treat her, otherwise it would be sullying her innocence. The matter is urgent. The only girl I know on this mountain top is you. Can you help me? Su Qingjuan's eyes lit up for no reason, looked at Lu Qin, hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, White Lotus, she is also a disciple of our Kunlun. Of course I should save her, you leave it to me. As she spoke, she stretched out her hand to take the White Lotus. Who knew that when she was holding White Lotus, there was a pause in the middle? Both of them were startled, looked down, and found that the already unconscious White Lotus at some point had one hand tightly grasped the collar of Lu Chen's chest, tightly not letting go, like a drowning person grasping the last life-saving straw, putting all her hope on it. Su Qingjun slightly frowned. Lu Chen immediately stretched out his hand, carefully pried off White Lotus's fingers one by one, and then sent her over. Su Qingjun nodded to him, turned around and was about to enter the house, but was stopped by Lu Chen. What's wrong? Su Qingjun asked with some puzzlement. Lu Chen took out a small bag from his bosom, stuffed it into Su Qingjuan's hand and said, There is a kind of poison on her wound. It will make the blood flow non-stop, and it will not heal. You can apply the powder in this to her wound, it will stop the bleeding. Su Qingjun was a little surprised but still took the small bag, then turned around and walked into the house. Lu Chen stood in the same place for a moment, then reached out to close the door, stood at the door, turned around, looked up at the dark sky and looked at the wind and rain, then let out a long breath. There was a trace of fatigue on his face. Then he casually sat down by the door, leaned against the wall and bent his legs. The wind and rain were still very strong, and there was a 3-foot eave above his head, but it still could not stop the flying rain from falling on him. But Lu Chen did not seem to care. He just sat quietly outside the house in the wind and rain, quietly staring at the dark world. The house was lit up as if a candle had been lit. A dim but warm light shone through the window, a touch of warmth in this dark and austere night. Lu Chen raised his head and glanced in that direction. He found that the window was not far from him. The light just happened to sweep past his head and fell into this narrow gap. It could not enter the wind and rain, nor could it block the chill, but it was still so fascinating. There was some movement in the house. It seemed that someone was busy. Lu Chen listened quietly, not saying a word. He sat in this dark corner and waited. After an unknown amount of time, suddenly there was a burst of footsteps behind the door. A moment later, a creak sounded, the door was opened, and Su Qingjuan's figure appeared behind the door, then walked out. Lu Chen looked at her, and her gaze swept across the surroundings before finally landing on Lu Chen, who was sitting on the ground, looking a little disheveled and exhausted. A halo enveloped Su Qingjuan's body. It was the candlelight in the room behind her, looking like she was glowing. Su Qingjun looked at Lu Chen's appearance, but after a while she walked over, squatted down beside him and said, The bleeding has stopped. Although the injury is not light, you should have given her some kind of panacea. The medicinal effect is very strong, so there should be no danger to her life, you can rest assured. Okay. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, nodded, and then said to Su Qingjun, Thank you. Su Qingjun stared at this man after a while, said in a low voice, Don't you have anything to say to me? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.